Good morning. Welcome to CyberTalks Day 1, presented by CyberScoop. I'm Goldie Kamali, your host and CEO of Scoop News Group, and I am thrilled to have you join us today. For the past 12 years, my team and I have been working closely with the White House on the tech priorities of each administration, bringing the brightest people from government and tech together to exchange best practices, collaborate, and identify new ways to work together to achieve common goals. CyberTalks is the best of those sessions, as well as some fresh new faces coming together to discuss ways technology can transform and secure government. As always, we have an amazing lineup for you today. I hope you're excited. Our speakers include C-level executives from the Executive Office of the President, Department of Defense, civilian agencies, the IC community, as well as leaders from some of the most innovative tech companies in the world. Today on day 1 of CyberTalks, we'll be discussing how the government is responding to the SolarWinds hack, disinformation, the state of cyber espionage, the evolution of APTs, zero trust, the cybersecurity executive order, ransomware, incident response, and cyber strategy. The goal for today is that you learn something new and leave inspired to do something big. Please tweet with us using the hashtag CyberTalks. I'd like to take a moment to thank our diamond sponsors, Accenture, Axiad, BlackBerry, Blue Vector, Cisco, Dell Technologies, Polyverse, Duo Security, Invicti, Leidos, Lookout, McAfee, Caresoft, and PCmatic. Thank you for your support. With that, let's kick off our program. I'm thrilled to introduce our first session. Please welcome the new federal CISO in the Executive Office of the President, Chris DeRusha, in a conversation with CyberScoop Senior Editor, Tim Starks. Welcome, gentlemen. Coming up next.
Hello, good morning. Happy to have you join us for the session here at CyberTalks called How the Government is Responding to the SolarWinds Hack. I'm Tim Starks, Senior Editor at CyberScoop. Joining me today is Chris DeRusha, the Federal Chief Information Security Officer.
Hi, good morning, Tim. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. So, Chris, as Federal Chief Information Security Officer, I'm sure your hands are very full and will be for a long while implementing the executive order the President signed, in part as a response to the so-called SolarWinds breaches of federal agencies, named, of course, after the company at the center of the supply chain attack. What are the biggest challenges so far for you, and what will they be going forward in terms of carrying out that order's directives?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Tim. Obviously, this is a pretty big executive order, and I describe implementation as a truly whole of government exercise. A lot of people involved. Within our office, the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer, we've got governance and oversight responsibilities across the federal government. Again, we're setting strategy and policy direction. And in this EO, we've got a big role to ensure that we're having successful implementation across all the agencies. And there's a couple categories I like to think of the EO and really kind of the facing out. We're covering a broad landscape of working to remove contractual barriers to sharing threat and incident information, drive consistency in application of cybersecurity contract clauses, leverage government buying power to incentivize secure software development. So other concepts like software bill of materials, and establishing a cyber incident review board so that we can look at these big events and draw lessons learned that everyone can apply across industry and government. And then facing in at the agencies themselves, federal agencies, what do we need to focus on? And one of the big pillars there that's going to be a multi-year exercise is implementing zero trust, for example. Another is just kind of going back to some of the things we've been working on for many years. Multi-factor and encryption also go hand in glove with our zero trust plans. And other things like logging, getting consistent logging across federal government, making some new big investments there. So, OMB, we've got a couple of roles in that. First is we have a bunch of actions of our own. We're going to be writing a lot of new policy direction based on everything I just mentioned. And if you look through the EO, you'll find that OMB's got a task pretty much in every section to issue some new federal guidance. We call them management memorandums here. But also we're working to help the agencies ensure that they're successful in their implementation. We're using things like the CIO and the CISO councils to drive progress, include CISOs and others in the drafting process for some of these deliverables, because again, they're going to need to implement them. So we want them to help us develop them and make them successful.
Yeah, I asked about your office in particular, but you did bring up the whole of government. Is there something that's going to be a particular challenge for the agencies to respond to this that are working with you?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you look at any of the pieces, you can say the word logging, but when you aggregate out, cloud logs, infrastructure, application, and you start to categorize out all of the logs that you need to retain for significant periods of time to do successful digital forensics exercise and to be able to kind of do monitoring and understand what activity is occurring or has occurred in your network. That's a huge multi-year exercise that each agency is going to have to undertake. So we can sum it up in a word, logging, but really when you think about it, it's really a key pillar of core cyber hygiene across. And same thing when you say multi-factor authentication. We've been at this for years with PIV implementation, but there are hard use cases that we're at now in several agencies, and we got to find solutions to work through them. Same with encryption. I mean, the kind of list goes on. So and endpoint detection and response capabilities. So some agencies have those in place, but even the ones that do could work from maturity, and some still don't have them.
Are there parts of the executive order that you think have been underappreciated broadly?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's been a lot of focus, in particular, because NIST has been busy. They've held a 2-day public session already, so I think a lot of the attention's been around things like sharing threat information through contract requirements with federal government, and some of the secure developments, supply chain actions and whatnot. So I think some of the things that I just mentioned have been a little less covered so far. I think another one that hasn't gotten much coverage, but is quite interesting, is just getting a playbook for agencies. Every security operations center has an incident response plan, but that's not what we're talking about. Agencies need a consistent playbook for senior managers to work through a big impact incident like SolarWinds. You've got a lot of different sections across an agency at play: leadership, procurement coming into play, management offices, counsel, privacy. You've got a lot of equities that you need to manage, and we're just going to try to help ensure that agencies, especially new administration, lots of new leaders and senior positions, have those tools at hand.
Yeah. I don't know if you could take me back. This attack first surfaced in early December. There were a lot of quick-paced revelations about what was happening, but then also months later, there was still information that was coming out. Can you take me inside how you were reacting and responding to the SolarWinds hack as it was unfolding in real time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, pretty quick in December. I know that was, again, I was not in this position at that point yet. The prior administration did stand up a response through the Cyber Unified Coordination Group, which is coordinated, led by National Security Council staff, has FBI, DHS, DNI, and other stakeholders involved. So that organ kicked into gear pretty quick. And when Ann Neuberger came in as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cybersecurity, she really took over the response effort day one, right? And was coordinating both the private sector coordination side and federal agency side. At OMB, we were involved in the UCG process on the federal agency remediation side, is where we came into play. So yeah, there's been a lot of CISA, DHS, FBI have been supporting several of those agencies' investigations. Agencies hired out some of those investigative needs to the private sector. It was really a kind of all hands on deck to determine what occurred and to ensure that we're bringing these networks back to a state of trust and continuity.
Yeah, to make sure I understand, you were involved in some element of the remediation, yes?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And what were your days and nights like? What kind of things were you actually doing on a day-to-day level, if you could get more specific?
It's funny, because I was on the campaign and then on the transition team. So my days and nights started, there, where I started to work informally through that process and learn about what was happening in the agencies before I even came in. So, by the time I hit the ground here on, I think it was January 22nd or something like that, I kind of been doing those late nights already. But yeah, look, it was a matter of both working with DHS CISA closely to understand what the impact was, that we understood. What we didn't know, there was a lot of that. These were very stealthy techniques. This was one of the more sophisticated attacks or campaigns that we've uncovered, and it's taken quite a bit of time to kind of like determine what the goals were at each of these agencies that it seemed to have been targeted.
Yeah. Besides the executive order, the president has proposed $750 million in the fiscal 2022 budget for the agencies most directly affected by these breaches. How much of a difference can that money make? And what would go the longest way toward making sure that something of the scope of SolarWinds doesn't ever happen again?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a lot of investments, both near term and long term, that we need to make. When you look at some of the vehicles we have for that, we set aside a reserve fund, which has gone to specific capabilities, maturing security operations centers, investing in logging, investing in encryption. You kind of look at some of these meat and potato investments, and that's been baked into the FY22 president's budget request. And so, you see a lot of that there. Then another one that we've got, another vehicle, is the Technology Modernization Fund. And we've definitely been encouraging agencies to focus on projects there that are driven by security outcomes and may have had a sort of direct impact to the SolarWinds event at their agency. So those are things that we've been working closely with agencies to encourage. There's a lot of interest because for the first time, we have decided to do some payment flexibility, repayment flexibility of the TMF, and so that's garnered a ton of interest into the TMF vehicle. So we're very excited about that as an opportunity. But so kind of on the investment side, we'll continue to work with agencies to determine what needs they have in 22 and looking forward. But the other question I think is kind of like what did we learn from this? What do we need to do? And a few points there. Yeah, first, I'd say it's good cyber hygiene can help prevent the initial attack in the first place, which occurred on the company. And this is something that we just can't lose sight of. That basic cyber hygiene matters everywhere. We also need to double down on secure development practices, applying more checkpoints and verification in the build process. We've got to enhance detection, recovery capabilities, processes. These are focuses in the EO. We've talked about enhancing maturity of logging, incident information sharing, moving towards zero trust. And another one that we haven't talked about as much, I'd say, is also harkening back to some of the programs we have in place. One that I was intimately involved in when I was here in a prior life in around 2015-16 timeframe, the High Value Asset Initiative. And I bring that up because we also can't lose sight of we need risk-based prioritization as well for some of those investments, and we really need to continue to maintain that enterprise-wide understanding of risk that's held by the agencies at an enterprise level, and ensure that we're giving the investments where they're most needed across agencies.
Yeah, you have talked about managing risk. It's one of your big talking points that you're very interested in making sure that people are thinking about. There's that old saying about being careful not to just be fighting the last war. Are there risks or threats around the corner you're devoting attention to for the future?
Yeah, look, one that we're dealing with head on is ransomware, obviously, and a different situation than what happened with SolarWinds, but is becoming a national security risk and problem, and will require kind of the full breadth of government focus and policy options and resources to address. I mean, we can't just leave this to network defenders and sort of work through them one by one. We've got to be proactive, and the administration is, and so that's work that's being led by the National Security Council staff. You see DHS and DOJ doing a lot of good work there. There's a lot of good conversations going on forward direction. But it's ransomware, potentially destructive malware. I worry a lot about potential physical impacts of these events. You saw it in Colonial, but actually in a way we didn't, because it didn't go into the ICS systems. That was a measure taken by the company preemptively to sort of manage the risk. But it could in a different scenario. And these are things that we are definitely attuned to. Serious physical impacts and consequences of these events, things we've been talking about for some time, are starting to manifest. And it's something that we are tuned to, and doing a lot of thoughtful work to address.
It's interesting that when I talk to people out in the world about what they think about the executive order, and some of the things that the administration is doing on cyber, they're impressed by the breadth of it, but there's still people who say we're not even close to doing as much as we should. Would you agree with that?
Look, you have finite resources in life in finite time. Okay, I mean, the CISO jobs across federal government are some of the hardest jobs out there. There's a lot of constraints doing this job in government, and you can't do everything at once. That's not a possibility, unfortunately. I think that this EO has got a lot of the right things in it to move us forward, and to make some of the progress that's been elusive over the years. And some of these are harder things, like ensuring we're getting live incident reporting from federal contractors into government is something that's very important to us. There will be some challenges to work through there, of course, and also just finding the time, resources, in talent in federal government to implement all of these things that we know we need to do is really still a challenge across the board. So I'm extremely open to blue sky thinking that we need to be doing more, we have to be doing more, we need to apply this latest tech. I mean, I think we all agree, but at the same time, we've got to do the blocking and tackling as well, and in some instances first. And there's a lot of gaps for us to fill, some of those uncovered in SolarWinds, that we really need to, in some sense, take a step back and get those shored up while we move forward with all of the innovation as well, right? And that's why I'm excited about Zero Trust. We've been working on some of these capabilities for years in the ICAM space, but there's a lot of maturation in implementation. This is going to change how IT operators manage their systems and work, how application developers work, and how people in agencies sometimes access resources. They'll notice a difference once we start applying some of these principles. And so it's a cultural shift for everybody on IT in the business. But it's really important, and it's one that I think is the right roadmap to move federal government forward on.
Yeah, you mentioned some of this, the broader efforts that from others outside government. Your resume is pretty fascinating for the job you're doing today. You've served in the executive branch, of course. You mentioned the previous life. You've also worked for Ford, the state of Michigan. You mentioned the Biden campaign. What lessons did you take from those jobs that apply to being the federal CISO today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, fortunately for me, I've spent some time in federal government. I mentioned I had 6 years at Homeland Security. Much of that time was in CISA, and I actually had the opportunity to work in the office that I now lead for a couple of years. So, I think 8 years of experience in the world that you're kind of working to manage is extremely helpful and gives a little bit of leg up. So I think that's first, maybe the most relevant. But you bring up some of the other things that I've been doing in the past 5 years or so. Ford Motor Company, state of Michigan, I'd say the Biden campaign, those in particular. And a few things. I'd say at Ford, I learned the important lesson of communication with the business and everything you're doing that impacts them, and the need to help them prioritize risk and figure out how to take all the data that they're being handed, and where to start and what to do first and how to manage communications around it. In other words, like I was starting to feel like we needed to do a better job in the CISO group of ensuring that we were doing service to the business side, because it is a business, and it is a profit making organization, and you owe it to them in a sense. And so but what I took back from that is like moving into the state experience is that is the right mentality to have, not just in industry, but in government too. It kind of being a CISO that is attuned to the business needs and how they consume information and their priorities, frankly, is crucial no matter what role you're in. The second thing at the state that was even probably more beneficial than the role I got now is state of Michigan centralized IT. And so, state government looks pretty similar to federal government, just a lot smaller. So we had about 20 agencies there, similar missions, lots of the same kind of regulated data, a lot of the same issues. So for me, it was really interesting to see what an actualized, centralized government, IT operation, security operation can look like, and how we can take some of that and improve our enterprise approach here at the federal level, even though we're not centralized. There's a lot of principles you can apply and that I've taken back. And then I'd say finally in the campaign was just when you go from a centralized state government unit to a entity that was created like a year before you join it, and 99 point something% SaaS cloud-based operation, in part due to COVID, that was a very interesting experience too. And it kind of showed me in a lot of ways like what the future can look like. If you can get into an environment where you can really kind of understand where all of your core assets are and build it from the ground up with security in mind and like zero trust principles in mind, you can be pretty secure. And even when you've got things like non-managed devices out there, there's technological options now to fix that. But I think we just kind of learned a lot from that experience too, and I have certainly learned a lot from all of these culminated experiences.
I think this will be my last question for you because we're running short on time. But Michigan does have a reputation for fostering cyber skills via initiatives like its cyber civilian corps. What do you think the U.S. government needs to do to bolster the skill level of its cyber workforce? Maybe just give one or two things, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, I would love to someday come back and talk about the Michigan Cyber Civilian Corps, because that is one of the coolest things out there. It's taking the spirit of American public service and putting it to work in the digital age, much like we've done with volunteer firefighting and other things. And so it's the right idea. It's really cool. But get into your question. Look, I mean, it's not just IT hard skills. I think there's lots of good methods out there in gaming and competitions that are working well to get younger generation interested and bring them into the workforce. But the thing that I'd highlight also is just soft skills. You're really needing people with problem solving ability, attention to detail, desire to learn, and I've talked about this already and will continue to, but communication skills and executive communication skills in particular. And I know that's a challenge because traditionally a lot of people didn't join the IT field because they enjoyed leaning forward and being the kind of head at the table, delivering the presentation. But the reality is we as IT professionals and security professionals need to be able to understand these risks. Digital is enabling everything now, and we need to be able to communicate with the business or mission side of our operations effectively.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Chris, and thank you, audience, for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the rest of CyberTalks, and thank you.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us today for the CyberTalks panel about combating disinformation. A lot of Americans associate information operations on social media with Russian efforts to influence US public opinion prior to the presidential election in 2016. In the years since, researchers have observed a steady increase in the outsourcing and evolution of this work. Often it now goes to public relations firms. We're going to get into all of that and more right now. I'm Jeff Stone, the editor-in-chief at CyberScoop, and I'm happy to be joined today by Camille Francois, the Chief Innovation Officer at the network analysis firm Graphica, and Graham Brookie, Director of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Camille, recently your team found what appears to be a marketing firm in Pakistan masquerading as news outlets to kind of promote this agenda. This included the use of freelance writers who may or may not have known about the true nature of their work. It's just an interesting kind of specific example that your team has seen recently. Is there anything about that case that stands out to you?
A few things, and just to be clear, this work was done in partnership with Facebook, who first identified that network, working with my team, and took action against it. I think three things here were particularly interesting to me. The first one is, once again, this is yet another instance of social media marketing firms playing a pivotal role in information operations. We see that increasingly. Even state actors rely on these types of firms as proxies. That gives them sort of a layer of plausible deniability. I worry about the industry that's forming around information operations for hire. I think here, there are really interesting parallels with cyber, right? The rise of cyber mercenaries. We have to really learn these lessons and tackle the rise of digital marketing firms and PR firms who are continuing to participate in these disinformation operations. The second thing that I thought was particularly interesting is this is also yet another case of disinformation actors impersonating media and impersonating journalists. That happens all the time. That means that if we want to more effectively defend against information operations, we have to protect real media voices. We have to protect journalists. We have to go and verify their pages on social media and make sure that we can effectively protect them against impersonation. And finally, I think a third thing that comes to mind that I found particularly interesting is in that campaign, in that case study, we see these disinformation actors turning to freelance recruiting platforms, in this context, Fiverr.com, to hire people to participate in these campaigns. Now, in this specific instance, they hired people who were actors to pose as newscasters and journalists. And so, you might think if you're a freelancer and hired to do that, you should really ask yourself, like, what am I really contributing to? But we've seen this use of freelancers be increasingly more frequent in these operations. Sometimes you have unwitting freelancers who have no idea what they're participating in, and sometimes you have freelancers who either know the context of what they're doing or are asked to do things that are bizarre enough that really they should ask.
Graham, you're nodding. I have to go to you next. Is something you want to add? You've seen this. Have you seen similar activity, I should say?
Yeah, what's fascinating is the layers that we now see in influence operations. I mean, one of the largest trends is, yes, we are seeing more influence operations. I think that's by nature of the fact that we're looking more for influence operations. So that's generally a good thing. But if Camille had laid out that entire story at like a bar, that would be stranger than fiction, right?
Right.
It would be very difficult to get a layperson to be like, oh yeah, no, that makes step 1 makes sense. Step 2 makes sense. Step 63 makes sense. And we're seeing more and more of that, right? For instance, a case that our team saw over the last couple of weeks was a Canadian PR firm based in Toronto creating fake news websites in India, generally to generate more business because those websites got a good amount of engagement. And then they were amplified by Indian embassies around the world. Right. And so where is the kind of first needle in that haystack? That's a very difficult answer, or that's a very difficult question to answer. And that's something that we continue to see in a lot of the cases around the world. I mean, we could point to cases in South Asia, like we just did. We could point to cases in Africa. We could point to cases right here in the United States. And this is a trend that we expect to see more of. And it should be it's uncomfortable, but we're going to have to be increasingly more comfortable unpacking the layers around each one of these types of influence operations. And frankly, there's not a very good and satisfying answer, right? A lot of the time we get asked about, okay, like, is there a playbook for this? And yeah, there is a playbook, sure, but that playbook is now volumes and volumes full of plays. And so unpacking exactly what we're talking about is increasingly difficult, and that should be okay with us.
Let's pick another specific example the DFR lab found, though, because I certainly take your point about this being a little bit too strange for fiction. If there was a movie about this, it'd be like, that seems like a little bit of a reach. DFR lab recently, though, found Facebook accounts that were tied to Russian interests promoting their own agenda in Sudan. What can you tell us about that, Graham?
Well, again, this was a case that was in partnership with Facebook specifically. They saw a couple of accounts that we happen to be looking at somewhat similarly, but from a completely different angle, which speaks to the fact that a lot of this work is iterative. It takes a lot of eyes looking at a lot of different angles to kind of come to a holistic picture. The case that you just mentioned is very interesting and it shows exactly how influence operations can be used in addition to like other priorities or in addition to other tactics. And so Yevgeny Prigozhin, oligarch who has been attributed to run the Internet Research Agency in Russia or on behalf adjacent but directed by the Kremlin, was giving food aid, hard food aid in Sudan in order with like pictures that say food for you with love from Yevgeny Prigozhin. So that's something that was happening in the real world. At the same time, there was a lot of activity on social media that was basically amplifying that. And so it's an example of influence operations amplifying something that's happening in the real world as an extension of a direct priority from a country, right? The long-term game in that case is that Russia would very much like to have port access in Sudan. And so they're engaged in a lot of activity in that country and elsewhere in that region, which is a direct extension of their foreign policy goals. And influence operations were one very specific part of that. And it took a lot of eyes on screens, including from Facebook, including from our team, to kind of come to ground to say, okay, here's all of the things that are going on here, including some social media activity, including some hard aid, including some mercenaries, all leading to the same person, and all leading to the same country, as a direct extension of something that's really important in geopolitics right now.
The way that all of those different kind of avenues of attack, for lack of a better word, of influence, I should say, is very interesting. Camille, you kind of alluded to that a few minutes ago with the idea that there's these kind of hacker for hire groups that are now operating in some of the same ways that disinformation for hire might be kind of moving toward. How do you measure, though, I'll put this to you both, how do you measure or determine whether a specific campaign is successful?
That is a great question, and it's so hard. So let me start by talking a little bit about why that's hard, right? The first thing is there are different ways in which a campaign can be successful, and there are different ways in which a campaign spreads. I like a framework that has been compiled by a colleague who's both of our colleague, Ben Nemo, who talks about the breakout scale, right? This idea that you can be viral on one platform, right? You put a message on one platform, for instance, Twitter, it's got a lot of reshares. You can be viral on multiple platforms. You can also have offline impact. And it's not necessarily the case that one of these is better or worse, right? They lead to different impact on society. Let me give you two examples. It would be problematic to have an information operation have a very viral traction on one platform. To a certain extent, this is some of the things we've seen in the 2017 IRA campaigns, because nobody was looking for them. They were allowed to be on multiple platforms for years. They had really managed to create an audience that really was engaging and amplifying their content. That's one type of problematic impact. But sometimes you see campaigns that have none of this virality, but are managing to put the right message to the right person at the right time, potentially designing for an offline impact. Now, granted, it doesn't have a lot of retweets or a lot of likes, but this is potentially a more problematic impact depending on context. Finally, you have campaigns that are hard to root out just because they're so spread across platforms. Another instance of a campaign that we both worked on is secondary infection. That was one of the most cross-platform campaign we've ever worked on. It spread on more than 250 platforms. That gives that campaign the type of resilience that's really difficult to unpack, because you need to go to many, many providers and sort of come with this very complicated explanation. Look, this is what's happening on your platform. We need to discuss that. So impact is contextual, and there are very different ways to have problematic impact, which is why we use these complex frameworks to assess it.
What do you think,
Graham?
Graham?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, any question of impact starts with, okay, well, what was this influence operation trying to influence? And sometimes those are really, really big things, like changing the public opinion in a whole society, or they're really, really small things, like getting one person to read one thing and change one little bit of their behavior. And so within that range of stuff, you have to understand exactly what that influence looks like, or what they're trying to influence, what their theory of change is, essentially. And that changes a lot from influence operation to influence operation. I think one of the questions that we've gotten consistently since 2016 is, okay, well, and I say this with a degree of irony because all of us are trying to move past the conversations that we've had about 2016. But one question that we still get is, okay, well, there was foreign influence from Russia, and that is a fact, right? We've done hard attribution. We know exactly what type of content that looked like and what the range of activity was. But how many voters did that change, right? Like how many votes did that actually get in places like Michigan? And whoever has an answer for that is either overconfident or they're lying, right? There isn't an answer for that. And so having a degree of, okay, here are the range of things that we could probably figure out, like how many people this reached, and here are the things that we probably can't figure out, like what is the exact behavior change across all of that potential reach, right, is something that any credible research organization in this space, or a credible person in this space, entity, whether it's a government, whether it's a platform, whether it's a research group like ours, right? Like they have to be honest about that up front to say, here are the limitations of what we know, especially when we're talking about online activity.
Just to build on that, if I may, I think that the point that Graham's making here is really important. It's also one about maintaining humility in our analysis of these campaigns. Sometimes we're able to determine that there is an operation, there's a set of fake accounts, and we can see their activity, but we're actually not able to attribute the activity. And therefore, sometimes we face operations that we don't really know what is the goal they're trying to achieve. We can describe the activity. We can say this is what it looks like they were trying to do. But sometimes we operate in an environment where we have to be able to admit here, because we don't know exactly who is behind this, we can't really say with great granularity and detail and high confidence what they're actually trying to achieve.
I understand all of this is complicated, and it often depends on understatement, right? But often it depends on the specific example that we're discussing or that you're looking into. One of the things that seems to be emerging out of this conversation as we get smarter over the past few years is this idea of incentives or disincentives, excuse me. What is the reason to not launch an information operation? Aside from the moral, ethical standpoint, if you're looking at it from a clinical cold perspective.
Well, it depends on again, what type of influence you're trying to have, but one is being labeled, right? One is the naming and shaming effect of being discovered. That said, again, in unpacking the complication, there are very few satisfactory answers in this space, right? And so for some actors, it's actually really great for them to be exposed, right? And we have to be really careful about that in the incentives bucket to say, okay, well, if DFR Lab or Graphica or another research organization or a government or a platform or whoever labels somebody or discovers somebody, exposes somebody for engaging in manipulative behavior online or lying online, engaging in influence operations online, then is that something that actor wants? Which for a lot of the folks that are involved in foreign influence, right, being discovered creates a specter of foreign influence that is somewhat a degree of success for them, right? If we're all spending a lot of time really, really, really worrying about something that they're not actually doing at scale, sure, then that's a resource strain. And so the incentives, it depends again across what actor, right? We have geopolitical actors. That's what we put like the foreign influence operations. We have a lot of ideological actors, and those folks aren't specific to one location, truly global in many different ideologies. And then we have a lot of economic actors, and the economic actors are meaning those who spread influence operations or disinformation, misinformation for money, and that set of incentives is probably the easiest to identify, right?
Sure.
Grifters will always grift. And if you take away
Scammers, right.
their ability to grift, then they probably won't do it anymore. But where there's a lot of overlap between those different types of actors, you have to kind of go at the incentives of each one of those actors in order to create a more kind of resilient information ecosystem.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can think of actors who hate being exposed and for whom it really is a deterrent effect, right? It is shameful that they got caught doing this. The exposure is counter to the objectives that they were trying to achieve with the campaign, and of actors for whom it's exactly the opposite, right? The exposure perhaps was even the point of the campaign. That
Right.
makes it very difficult. I think the question that this raises too is one of deterrence. It's already so hard in cyber, right? We have difficult discussions on what does deterrence even mean in cyber. I think of our field sometimes as almost the little sister field to cyber. There's a lot we can borrow, improve on. There's also a lot we can perhaps leave behind. We haven't even started having serious discussions at scale on what does deterrence mean in our field, given the great diversity of actors, and what can we study in terms of countermeasure to actually have an empirical sense of what has a deterrent effect on in our field. So loads of new answers to be discovered there, great papers to be written.
If you have the time. The cyber analogy is a good one. It's something, cybersecurity itself is something certainly that lawmakers and folks on Capitol Hill are starting to think more about more urgently, certainly over the past few months. I think that disinformation as a little sister to that conversation is apt. One of the things that I had hoped to discuss with both of you today is this idea of norms. We know that in cyberspace, for instance, it's rare, hasn't happened in the United States at least, for a sophisticated nation state group to kind of turn out the lights, this big scary idea of affecting the power grid. That's a norm, right? If it was violated, that's kind of a big deal. Is there any, are you seeing any semblance of norms in information operations or anything is off limits, for instance? I'll put it to you both.
So I agree that in many ways, it kind of this information disorder, disinformation, misinformation is a little sister field of cybersecurity. The one thing that I would say about cybersecurity is that it's slightly more organized. So while threats are becoming more diffuse and more complicated, and we need to build a lot of infrastructure in order to like be more resilient against hard cyber threats, it's also a harder security space, right? There are hard technical indicators. There's a lot more. And I'm sure that we would have a large debate with a lot of the hard cybersecurity actors, having kind of spread both of those fields for a little while.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's slightly more organized, and there's slightly more technical indicator, like hard knowledge, right? And where we talk about misinformation, disinformation, especially in the norm space, it's a lot more messy. And we're gonna have to be more comfortable with it being more messy. It's like disinformation influence operations is like a Rorschach test for society. And it delves into like the worst parts of, or the like largest fissures within societies. And that's really, really, really difficult. So when we're talking about technical indicators for disinformation, we're also talking about like really, really, really hard social issues, which is the point, right? They're trying to create more fissure, create more influence, create, frankly, more chaos across the information space. Where we're talking about norms, I think the main point is that we don't have international norms, especially for foreign influence operations that include things like online manipulation. We don't have them. We know a lot of the things that we are generally against, or that we generally agree are definitely not above board. For instance, foreign influence in elections. That's not okay. There's a wide degree of consensus that that is not okay. But to the extent where we live in a very hyper-connected world, or a globalized world, influence and influence by foreign actors is a reality. And so what are the things that we completely agree are not okay? What are the things that are to be expected, right? If a country acts on something and it affects another country, then we should expect that country to have an opinion about that, right? And then there's a lot of messy stuff in between that is probably okay in some cases, but definitely not okay in other cases. And we don't have norms for that space. And that is a critical challenge that where Camille is talking about deterrence, until we have those norms, it's really, really difficult to set up deterrence in a really effective way.
Yeah, just to finish on the little sister field thing, I think part of that is very true when we think about information operations, influence operations, foreign interference. That's very close to cyber because we borrow from some of the attribution techniques, we're close to some of the deterrence debates, and ultimately there are many actors in common in both spaces. Now, the more we go towards misinformation, the further away we go from that field. And I think it's very important when we talk about dis and misinformation to acknowledge that we group in these buckets a lot of problems that really have nothing to do together, right? They're actually different disciplines. On the norm side, which applies again to the question of information operations, influence campaign, foreign interference. As a French person living in the US, I'm really interested in the role that democratic states are going to play in setting up those norms. What are these governments going to say? These are the red lines. This is what we think can get respected. And here, I think we are lacking data on the ways in which they themselves engage in influence operations. We know it happens, right? And we need to have more open conversations about that.
We won't set aside time yet for this conversation to come up at the UN Security Council yet. My words, neither of yours. Okay, Graham, Camille, thank you both again for joining us today. Always great to speak with you, and we will be sure to pester you in the future. But until then, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to answer the polling question in the polling sidebar to the right.
Coming up next.
Hello, my name is Jim Dolce and I'm the CEO of Lookout. I'm glad to be here today at CyberTalks. 2020 has forced us all to do things a little differently. Whether you switched your annual summer holiday for a staycation or canceled your family Christmas plans to stay at home, the year has forced us to reimagine many of our most deep-rooted rituals. The upheaval and uncertainty we've experienced in our lives this year has also impacted the way we do business. The pandemic shifted the majority of us to remote work. In response, our IT managers quickly expanded VPN capacity to provide secure connectivity for remote workers. At the same time, they began moving on-premise applications to the cloud while adopting SaaS-based products like Google Workspace, Microsoft 365, Salesforce, Slack, and others. 1 year later, employees are now able to work from anywhere on any device. Data and applications have moved to the cloud. The internet is our new corporate network, and the enterprise perimeter has all but disappeared. As the global workspace has become more mobile and more reliant on cloud applications, legacy security models must now change. The old castle and moat security approach, where applications and data assets are secured behind a firewall in a corporate data center, is no longer effective. This outdated perimeter-based model required remote user traffic to be backhauled long distances to the corporate data center using VPN tunnels. By converging all VPN tunnels at a central location, IT managers were able to achieve global data visibility and control. Of course, as businesses go remote and applications move to the cloud, this hub and spoke approach has lost its effectiveness. In light of all this, 2021 appears to be the end of the VPN age and the beginning of a new era towards adopting a zero trust strategy. According to a survey, 72% of organizations are prioritizing the adoption of a zero trust model, and 59% have accelerated their efforts due to the prevailing focus on remote work. All this comes against a backdrop where hackers disrupted a major gas and fuel pipeline that serves the East Coast of the United States and demanded and received ransomware. A scan of the daily headlines reveals just how relentless the waves of attacks have become. In fact, the problem has become so serious that President Biden is now calling for stepped up security. To be more specific, the president has issued an executive order titled Improving the Nation's Security that would modernize cyber defenses and, in effect, mandate a zero trust architecture. In fact, agencies are required to have a plan for zero trust within 90 days. Under a zero trust model, trust is never implied and access is granted only on a need to know, least privilege basis defined by granular policies. Let's take a look at some of the technologies involved in implementing the zero trust architecture. The research and advisory firm Gartner has categorized these technologies under the term SASE, or Secure Access Service Edge. SASE is essentially the convergence of several existing cloud-based security technologies. These technologies include Cloud Access Service Brokers, or CASB, Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA, Secure Web Gateways, Data Loss Prevention, or DLP, and certain others, all delivered by a cloud service at the network edge. I'll take each of these individual technologies now one at a time. First, a CASB is a cloud-based software that acts as an intermediary between an individual remote user and a cloud application, such as Box, Dropbox, Google Workspace, Slack, etc. CASBs emerged as services began shifting to the cloud and employees began using these services with or without prior knowledge or approval of IT. CASBs now provide IT managers with visibility into these cloud services and all the cloud services in use across the enterprise, while enabling them to implement security controls. The second SASE technology, ZTNA, another critical technology needed to achieve a zero trust model. In fact, ZTNA is now being deployed as an alternative to VPNs. ZTNA protects access to private enterprise applications, whether those applications are running in a private data center or if they've been moved into a cloud environment such as Microsoft Azure, AWS, or Google's GCP. The technology also helps reduce complexity and implementation time for IT managers as organizations move assets across multiple clouds, especially when you compare the deployment and configuration complexity of traditional VPNs used in the same way. More companies now are adopting the cloud, and as a result, 37% of them are turning to ZTNA in the very near future to enable this multi-cloud strategy. The final technology, secure web gateways. Secure web gateways protect web surfing users from infection by filtering unwanted malware and user-initiated internet traffic while enforcing corporate and regulatory policy compliance. Early secure web gateways were deployed as on-premise hardware appliances. However, with the shift of applications and data to the cloud, one of the great attractions of a cloud-delivered secure web gateway is that it allows remote users to send their traffic directly to the cloud where traffic processing and security can be enforced. One last technology to talk about that's part of the zero trust family is called data loss prevention, or DLP. DLP is a practice of detecting and preventing data breaches and exfiltration of sensitive business information. DLP tools allow security staff and network administrators to set business rules or policies that determine what's sensitive while also providing insight into the use of content within an enterprise. Now, because these three SASE core services, namely CASB, ZTNA, Secure Web Gateway, are all resident in the data path, they're all able to intercept traffic being downloaded. And in turn, They provide the perfect point to enforce DLP policies across both data at rest and data in transit. In effect, they act as guardrails that prevent users from unintentionally exposing sensitive data. One final note, all of this sounds complex: CASB, ZTNA, Secure Web Gateway, DLP, SASE, lots of new technologies, lots of new terminology here. Now, it is best to deploy these multiple core services in a single cloud delivered platform. This allows IT managers to apply the same consistent policies to all content transferred to or from any of these SaaS applications, whether it's CASB being used to access SaaS-based applications, ZTNA being used to access private enterprise applications running in either a private data center or in the cloud, or whether it's user-initiated internet traffic being secured by a secure web gateway. Best approach to deploying these technologies is to deploy them on a common platform, along with the ability to do DLP on all the traffic, independent of where it's going. So to summarize, the pandemic has accelerated digital transformation, probably 2 to 3 years ahead of where we would have been had we not had the pandemic of the past year. We're pushing forward faster than we ordinarily would have into these new technologies, challenging IT managers and challenging IT organizations to deploy more technologies faster in order to support our remote users. The best approach to doing this, the simplest approach to doing this, is to find solutions, platform solutions, that allow you to deploy these technologies in a single user interface, in a single instance, and get the benefit of being able to cross policies across each of these various different technologies. Lookout, of course, is committed to delivering these technologies to federal, state, and local agencies, secured through a common platform that has been deployed for many years now across many of these agencies. Thank you very much for your time today, and please give us a shout if you're looking for more information. Thank you very much.
Coming up next.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us today for this fireside chat at CyberTalks. I'm Jeff Stone, the editor-in-chief at CyberScoop, and I'm happy to be joined today by Kevin Mandia, the chief executive at FireEye. FireEye is known for its work in detecting cyber espionage. Most recently, the suspected Russian hacking campaign in which attackers used software from the federal contractor SolarWinds to gather intelligence from a number of US federal agencies. Kevin, thank you for being here. Tell us about the moment when you realized that this hack at SolarWinds was maybe a little bit larger than the usual breach.
Well, Jeff, thanks for having me on this, and it's always fun to talk about us. Tell you about the moment when we noticed the attack. For me, it was an interesting moment because I spent most of the 90s responding to computer security breaches on behalf of the United States Air Force, and then later as a contractor, primarily working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I can just tell you, as this materialized to me, it was on a Friday afternoon. I had pattern recognition pretty early in the briefing that there was pretty good alignment between intrusions I'd seen out of Russia in my past and what we were dealing with at FireEye. So even though it was early onset, I was getting a briefing with very little data, and we're in what I call the fog of war phase, Jeff. It was pretty immediate to me that we had a problem because somebody came in at user level credentials, but immediately showed and demonstrated they had administrative rights as well, all in the same connection that I was being briefed on. And the question was, well, how did they get the passwords? How did they know to log in? The answer, they've been in before, and we didn't notice. So now we know there's some surreptitious actor on our network for an undisclosed amount of time, unknown amount of time. To me, pretty quickly, this was kind of the breach I was worried about. and we escalated right away at that point.
You mentioned the fog of war, and I can imagine the thoughts and emotions that are kind of going through you and your team's mind when you're sitting there and you're kind of, it's dawning on you the severity of the type of thing that you're looking at. What is the process for alerting SolarWinds about what happened? How do you think about that? How do you go through that notification?
So when we learned about the incident, we didn't know about the SolarWinds platform having an implant. This was, a week or two before then, maybe even more than that. We just knew we had indicators of an intrusion at FireEye. And we started, because we were kind of prepared for this sort of thing with forensic software everywhere. We started looking under every single rock. Let's look here, let's look there. We didn't even care where the evidence led us. We followed the evidence thread, but we also carpet bombed the whole environment, looking for any shred of evidence from all the threat actors we were aware of. So imagine just doing an ultrasound of every single system on the FireEye network. And what kept happening, Jeff, is that the earliest evidence of compromise we could find happened to be the SolarWinds server at FireEye. And that was, several weeks into the investigation. And we couldn't find anything else. There was no spearfish. We couldn't find a backdoor. And it got to the point where, the infamous Occam's razor type of situation, if there's no other explanation, then the obvious one is the SolarWinds system must be the source of the intrusion. So then we did something that nobody really wants to do,
right?
Especially when you're in our business. We had to reverse engineer pretty much the whole SolarWinds platform to see if we could find an implant. And then, at that point, you got to put people on notice. But I can tell you this, Jeff, before we even found the implant, in the back of my mind, personally, the intrusion into FireEye was most consistent with Russian foreign intelligence. And I never really felt we were target number one. I kept thinking, well, if they're here in our networks, I'm certain we're not the only operation going on. They're in a bunch of other places as well. But specifically to you on the notification of SolarWinds, there's a time frame where you want to do this, where once you confirm something, you do want to afford SolarWinds time to get their arms around what happened and what to do about it. But in this case, we didn't, get afforded that time necessarily.
What was it about it that indicated in the back of your mind? Maybe it's just experience or some of the learning experiences that you've had in the past that would indicate it's a Russian espionage operation versus something else.
A couple of things that I saw. First, very early on in our investigation, we saw incredible minimization on collection, quite frankly, meaning the threat actor was showing it would have been easier just to break in and delete everything, break in and steal everything. Instead, they were doing specific keyword searches. Quite frankly, the only offense I've ever seen do that comes out of Russia, looking for specific keywords that weren't known publicly, meaning they had broken in, learned some things, and then applied what they were learning. So this showed real knowledge. If this was ransomware, we would have already been ransomware. If it was a criminal element, we would have already been extorted. By the time we found this thing and we started doing an investigation, the string search criteria was an indicator, the accessing of our network the way we do, and accessing, I'd liken it to this, Jeff. If you're gonna rob a hotel, there's two ways to do it. And to the untrained eye, the best way is let's get the master key that opens up every single hotel room. We'll just run around using that. It opens up room 401, 402, 403. And we'll use one key, steal everything. The way they acted in our networks, when they compromised room 401, they used the key for room 401. When they compromised room 402, they used a key for 402. That's OPSEC. What they were doing is using the exact right credentials for every single system that they were breaking into on our network. That's discipline, that's training, that's methodical. And I don't see any other nation doing that, quite frankly, other than Russia.
What is the largest thing, or what is the largest lesson, I should say, that this campaign in particular teaches us about cyber espionage?
Well, I think everybody's trying to figure out what are the rules of engagement? What's fair game for espionage? And I don't think there's a rule book on this stuff. And as technology advances, it advances faster than any rule book that we could write anyway. But that was, to me, in the back of my mind, it was, hey, are we fair game? You know, we're a .com. And throughout my career, when you see the Russian intrusion set, it is very rare that they go into .com, in my opinion, at least from my experiences. And it's very rare that they get caught by .com. In fact, I'm unaware of a .com entity actually finding these folks. So this was new to me. It shows that the rules of the game are a little bit different. And so that, you know, is it fair game for another government to risk 18,000 different organizations as collateral damage? Because that's what happened here, is that the implant in SolarWinds was downloaded by about 18,000 companies.
Right.
And I think what we learned is it's you know, it's fair game to hack the supply chain.
Not a positive lesson, if you will. The idea of this is certainly not new. It's a little bit different, as you just alluded to. You, though, Kevin, are a public face who has kind of testified about this, this specifically in front of Congress, and you're someone who's out there in terms of dealing with cyber espionage. Have you changed your own behavior to avoid attention from some of these groups that FireEye's thinking about?
Well, you never want to draw their attention.
Right.
You know, what you're learning in cybersecurity, particularly, you know, air, it's the .mil domain. Land, sea, you rely on the governments to defend you. Space, the government. But then you get to cyber, and you look at the front lines of the cyber domain, and it's the private sector. And you start recognizing that you're operating in an area that in the other domains, it's primarily the government that does the offense and the government that does the defense. And that's why governments were formed, really, to protect a society or a society's ideals. And so cyber is going to, you know, in cybersecurity, I think it's a little different. You're considered, to some extent, part of the apparatus that defends a nation, or defends nations for that matter. And because of that, you appear to be fair game for cyber espionage. I do believe this, Jeff, and it's when a nation targets a company, the nation wins over time. Right. And unfortunately, I go to 1980s hockey analogies. Going against the Russian SVR is going against Wayne Gretzky on a penalty shot. You don't want to be in goalie for that. The puck's getting in the net. They're very good at what they do. They're methodical. And it's a challenge. And if you give Wayne Gretzky a lot of penalty shots, he's going to score a lot. Right. So the best thing I guess, if you don't want to be compromised, you stay off the radar. And, but in cybersecurity, that's hard to do. You know, you've got to protect sides from other sides.
I have to ask you about a Reuters report that came out a few months ago. There was an indication that there was an FBI investigation into the idea that you yourself might have received a postcard or some kind of letter from a suspect in this case, whether that be a Russian spy or someone else. Is there anything you can say about that? Help us understand.
Well, I just think that's the challenge with cyberspace, is it is so anonymous, and it's such a great area of operations, and you have such great plausible deniability that it makes it frustrating to understand if anything that happens in the physical world, is it genuinely connected to the cyber world or not. But what I learned from the SolarWinds implant and who they targeted, the security companies and the software companies are absolutely fair game for espionage. And in different countries, you know, we learn their rules, Jeff, by observing them from the outside. I don't think published doctrine on here's the rules to espionage. Every nation will have different rules based on the asymmetry of it and their capabilities. You know, from what I can observe, looking at Chinese cyber espionage, healthcare is fair game, and pharma is fair game, and universities are fair game. And with Russia, I thought they had much of a smaller target area that they worked and operated in. It was usually .mil against .mil, .gov against .gov, defense industrial base. We just saw it broaden, period. So the bottom line, it's hard. There's a lot of gray area and gray operations in cyber right now.
Saw an interview from yourself in March. You described that Iranian nation state hackers, for instance, are maybe most improved, almost on par with China. Can you just speak to that a little bit? You know, walk us through your thinking on these other states.
Yeah, I can tell you the first time I experienced, and my folks experienced, responding to confirmed Iranian threat actors was probably around 2008, maybe. And I don't remember when Stuxnet was, but it was similar to that time frame, quite frankly. And I just remember it didn't seem very good. I spent a lot of time in the 90s training a lot of government agencies on how do networks work and how do you compromise networks. And the intrusions we were responding to almost looked like people coming right out of the classroom. They just weren't good. And I'll give you an example. Two things. One, if the threat actor is using a custom tool, they used it right, meaning they were trained on it, meaning we couldn't find that tool in a public forum. We couldn't find that tool in any public website. But when they used publicly available tools, they used them wrong.
Right.
So when they were trained on the custom stuff, nailed it, but they didn't do the work to figure out the public available malware that they sometimes deployed or used. Second thing is, one of the intrusions we were responding to, an Iranian hacker got into a computer and compressed the whole hard drive, not just the directories that had things of interest. And that's an easy way to get caught. It's not surreptitious. And quite frankly, if you don't minimize on collections, you are creating some work on the back end. But they advanced to the point where somewhere around 2017, not only were they prolific, and they are operating with rules. Like, in certain geographies, they might go destructive. In the United States, they don't. They do target media and entertainment.
Interesting.
Don't. Yeah, but they developed what I called X-Agent framework, just a framework to adopt their offensive weaponry very quickly. So if antivirus detected something, new module plugs in, and they're good to go. And AV's always had a tough time with signatures, just detecting a dropper, they call it, or a downloader, or an agent that can be updated on the fly. Iranian threat actors have that now, and that just shows kind of in the rites of passage of nations, zero-day capability, operating outside your normal theater of operations, and having really a framework to create malware or tools that you need for offense in a much faster way. They have that now. They have all that in Iran now.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned the tricky way of doing a breach notification process correctly. Again, you've been involved in a lot of instances like this. The reason I asked you that a few minutes ago is because there's more conversation now on Capitol Hill and among lawmakers about a mandatory, maybe potential, it's all very kind of hypothetical, but a mandatory data breach reporting notification.
Right.
Any lessons that you can kind of share with us on a good way to do that, or a potential uniform law?
Absolutely, Jeff. I mean, first issue is this. You want to get information that can defend the nation into the right people in the right places at the right time. Breach notification is not that, because breach notification, that means there's a company that's been compromised and they're trying to get their arms around all the facts about the breach and all the liabilities about the breach. And because of that, that takes a while, and companies need to get their arms around it. But the threat intelligence, the TTPs being used by the attackers, that could be communicated quickly, anonymously, confidentially, and that's what's needed to defend the nation. So I believe that there should be threat intelligence sharing as a disclosure, and then a breach notification disclosure should be totally separate, different threshold, different timing, different information.
So you're saying, hypothetically, there's a healthcare company that's hit. They've identified, this is how they got in. This is who we think it was. This is, A, B, and C of what they did. But the notification to the customers is a totally different conversation.
It can be, because a lot of times, like if I notified everybody day one, the day I was briefed about what ended up being the SolarWinds investigation that we did, at least into the implant, all I would have done is created fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And we didn't know anything.
Sure,
We had no idea what we had lost. We had no idea what was at risk. And I think most breaches aren't. That was my old phrase, meaning, yeah, someone broke in, they didn't get anything. That is the majority of security incidents at companies. Somebody happened to have a third party was compromised, and the user account and passphrase for one of our employees was used to do something, but they didn't have a lot of access, didn't impact customers. That happens to people. You don't want to have a hair trigger and just scare people all the time when nobody knows anything. So there is going public too soon and creating alarm when there's no cause for alarm. And that's the concern. And a lot of legislators don't understand that, Jeff. They're like, well, if you're hacked and you know it, you should be telling the American people to scare the heck out of them for no good reason. I mean, it's we got to figure this out and do a little better. But to protect the nation in cyberspace, it's about threat intelligence sharing. You don't need to have the victims raise their hand and go public about it, as long as the nation can defend themselves from what's learned during those incidents.
It's difficult to find a simple solution to such a difficult problem. I can appreciate that. We're already low on time. I do not want to let you escape, though, without getting some thoughts, however briefly, on the White House executive order.
Well, I mean, I'm glad they did something, and I think they did the right things. I think a lot of thought went into it. There will always be Monday morning quarterbacks who are like, oh, they can't do this, and you can't do that, or it's not explicit enough. I actually thought it was great. It's a great step. It's a sprint. It's got very tangible actions. Some things need to be interpreted. Some things are pretty obvious, but it's going to level up the federal government security for sure. And it's got all of us thinking, and we already were, but it codifies how we got to think about supply chain security, and everybody's already doing that. So I thought any step at all, Jeff, would be a good one. And I think this one's even more comprehensive than what I expected. So there's going to, and by the way, the other thing, like the Cybersecurity Review Board for incidents, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Like the NTSB, that makes sense to me, because then we can start coordinating as a nation to the different attacks that hit us. I always say wherever crime goes, wherever money goes, crime follows. That's cybercrime. Wherever information goes, espionage follows cybercrime, because we're all sharing emails and our deepest thoughts right on our computers. It's how we communicate. But where command control goes, cyber warfare goes, and all these things are being controlled by systems now. I remember somebody asked, are the satellites vulnerable? I said, well, if a computer on Earth is, then the satellites are, and so that means we have to think about these things with the public and the private sector working together. And a review board allows the nation to know more. And you'll see threat intelligence sharing coming out of the executive order, breach disclosure, something the nation's going to wrestle with and get as close to right as we can get it. All these things are going to come towards when a SolarWinds-like attack happens, or the Pulse Secure 0 days happen, or ransomware attacks against all of these companies in the United States are happening, because we're like the tackling dummies for ransomware right now. We can respond as a nation. And that's important. And I think the executive order took a big step in that direction.
Do I sense optimism, Kevin?
Well, there's a lot of times when you can't have optimism, but we've been worse than this in reality. Okay. I can tell you 2020 was probably the hardest year to be a CISO since I started doing cybersecurity back in 1993. I think being a chief information security officer and you have ransomware out there. And I liken that if Wayne Gretzky's the Foreign Intelligence Service on a penalty shot, ransomware is like you're in goalie and there's 1,000 people just shooting the puck at you. They're not very good, but sooner or later the puck gets in the net. We just don't have a deterrence for it. And 2020 was a tough year. 2021 with the executive order, I think that goes a long way towards taking a step towards more positive risks and repercussions to the threat actors that are attacking all the organizations in the United States.
Kevin Mandia, thank you again for joining us. Looking forward to next time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Coming up next.
Hi, I'm Wyatt Cash at Scoop News Group, and we're here at CyberTalks with Rob Lalu-Mandir, Senior Director for Federal Civilian Business at McAfee. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Wyatt.
Well, let me start by asking, what does it mean to have a baseline level of cybersecurity in today's context in 2021?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of changes in the last couple of years on what it means to have a cybersecurity baseline. But I always like to think this minimum baseline is having like 4 key tenets or organizational buckets that all businesses and agencies should be really tackling and tracking throughout the progression. I think the first one is that you need to have a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy for incident response. Not only respond to incidents quickly and effectively, but also to continue to strengthen your organization's defenses against those incidents. I think that second tenet there is to take a hard look at threat sharing across your environment. Most organizations have pockets and offshoots and little regional and organizational pockets that they need to manage. And your architecture and your solutions you choose should really enable interoperability and create the ability to share intelligence at near real time across your enterprise. I think most importantly, they have to be relevant and timely to the cybersecurity threats and challenges that you're facing in your specific industry. And then I think, the third, I said there were kind of 4 tenets here. I think the third one is to create linkages between your technology environment and your policies. And I think this allows you to take practical first steps by implementing security best practices and then building them into your policy. For example, a lot of organizations are doing this, but I think it's important to keep tracking these things. Vulnerability assessments, system updates, your backups, inventory control, all of those things are critical for establishing that baseline. I think last, but certainly not least, creating a cyber smart workforce is just absolutely paramount. Nearly 98% of all cyber attacks still rely on some form of social engineering to deliver malware. And phishing emails and accidental password compromise and things like that are still very much a thing. I know we've been talking about this for a long time, but it's still a big issue. And it's imperative that we as cybersecurity leaders create training and certifications and organizational focus on those security basics.
Well, thanks for articulating those 4 tenets for our viewers. Next, let me ask, how would you say the pandemic affected the way that agencies are securing their data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think enterprises and agencies were and still are faced with this really daunting challenge of remote work. It was all over the tech media about how to serve remote workers in this challenging time. But the IT professionals are still quickly shifting workloads to the cloud and still trying to navigate all those compliance and security challenges that come along with like almost a nearly non-existent enterprise perimeter. And I think this is where zero trust, one of the big buzzwords we've been hearing lately, zero trust. I think this is where zero trust really comes in. It provides a more data-centric approach rather than trying to focus on securing specific networks or hardware. In some of the high-profile attacks we've seen, nation states and organized crime are funding full-time research and zero-day exploits and the development of sophisticated ransomware. Once those attackers are in your networks, they have trusted status and can move throughout your network and micro networks to discover and steal data. But I think to their question, I think the good news is that enterprises are responding to this. They're implementing micro-segmentation for internal infrastructure that has opened doors to SaaS applications. And we used to throw a ton of tools at on-premises problems. Tools like data loss prevention and encryption and file access controls. But these types of tools have largely not been implemented across most as-a-service clouds in a really organizational comprehensive way. So that's definitely one issue. And then we're also seeing this digital transformation driving a new wave of demand for additional endpoint protection to address new vulnerabilities, along with an EDR to provide real-time analysis and leverage AI for guided investigations of these attacks. So I think this focus on securing data rather than the infrastructure is a welcome response to the pandemic that we're going to continue to see well into the future.
Well, I know that the landscape for cybersecurity is always changing, but in light of some of the most recent high-profile incidents, Colonial Pipeline to mention just one, what kinds of changes do you expect to see in the cyber world over the next year?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking about zero trust, and I think we're going to continue to see that trend throughout the next 12 months. I think organizations are going to spend this next year adopting zero trust tactics and methodologies, whether they know it or not, but they're going to start focusing on heavily on the data traversing devices, clouds, and users. But overall, I think some of the biggest changes we're going to see in the next 12 months that we're all going to see in the news are around threats. I think there's going to be a huge uptick in attacks on personal devices that exploit mobile payment apps and rapidly adopted technologies. I'll just give you an example of QR codes that, we're all going to restaurants now and we use those QR codes to pull up the menu. And that is a huge threat vector that I think we're going to see in the future. And we'll see more exploits of technologies like that. On the enterprise side, I think we're going to see definitely see a lot more copycat supply chain attacks, like the Sunburst campaign. The industry's been talking about these types of attacks for a long time, but I think we're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg here. We're starting to get more supply chain regulation coming from the government to protect sensitive data, and in private companies to protect trillions of dollars in intellectual property. And I think another big threat trend we're going to see is the continued rise of highly sophisticated cloud platform attacks. Cloud adoption for business services has been increasing by triple and even quadruple digit percentages. So we're seeing an even greater increase in attacks on those cloud accounts. So that, those accounts are absolutely goldmine for cyber criminals. Organizations with remote workers using unmanaged devices to access those applications are at huge risk. And especially when those cyber criminals just leverage a little bit of human intelligence to understand who their high value targets are. Those executives, engineers, IT professionals, just to name a few. And they take advantage of those weaknesses. And one I still hear all the time and I'm always completely flabbergasted by is reusing the same password for many accounts. So many people still do it, and it's such a huge threat to internal data security.
And lastly, Rob, what would you say is the biggest thing that you think most people don't really appreciate or understand about cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really, one issue that's always really top of mind for me is the public's appreciation for how serious this cyber threat is. And, the sheer number of cyber attacks that we see in the news on almost a daily basis in major publications, these attacks are occurring so often, and they're on such large institutions that I think we're sort of losing a full appreciation for the damage and potential for devastation, despite Colonial Pipeline, just to name one that was a huge issue for us. But I think we've grown a little bit numb to it. So I think it's hard to really rally public support around a faceless criminal. And with these attacks occurring so often, they become normalized, and we start to use really sterile words about them, like breach or compromise, rather than what they really are, which is crime. And I'll admit, even as an industry practitioner, I often kind of run under the size and scale of some of the crime that's involved. But I think people in our industry really, they do know how bad this next major attack could be. But it takes more than just us. It takes more than a small handful of cyber experts and IT professionals to prevent this sort of thing. We need to find better ways to scale messaging for cyber awareness and education to our coworkers, family, and friends, and help everyone really understand the role they play in preventing that next big cyber attack.
Well, Rob Lalou-Mandir, thank you so much for taking some time to share your insights on the cybersecurity space and some of the things that we all need to be taking a look for and appreciating more seriously. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Wyatt.
Coming up next.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us today for this fireside chat at CyberTalks, presented by Scoop News Group. I'm Jeff Stone, the editor-in-chief at CyberScoop, and I'm happy to be joined today by Ron Nixon, the Vice President for Global Defense and Government at Polyverse. Ron, thank you for being here. You and your team are focused on advanced persistent threats, which is the name that we like to give state-sponsored hackers or particularly sophisticated groups, if you will. Give us a sense of how you're thinking about APTs and the way that you've kind of seen them behave in cyberspace.
And I'm glad you caveated it with that because, yeah, if you were looking back 5, 6, and definitely further back than that, 5 or 6 years ago or further back than that, then definitely the APTs were the nation state sponsored guys and gals. But you're beginning to see those same techniques and those same methodologies delve into the criminal space too, right? And when you look at APTs, first you got to kind of take the entire catalog of cyber bad guys out there. And I don't like using the term because you've got good guy hackers and bad guy hackers, right? But so if you think of them like in the context of like a jewelry heist, right? And so different people will attack a jewelry, try to attempt to rob a jewelry store in different ways. Right. And so you've got like the amateurs in the block, the noobs, the script kiddies, as we call them sometimes. That's your guy who picks up a rock, walks by the jewelry store, tries to smash the window and grab whatever he can. And then you've got your semi-professional people who may want to grab something really quick, attempted to hack, bring down a site from a cyber standpoint, but it's those guys who might run into the jewelry store real quick with a gun and try to get as much as they can out of the jewelry store. And in that category, I'm also going to look at your hacktivists too, because we don't hear as much about them anymore. Right. Because they're just not used the way they used to, but they're still out there. And that's that would be in the jewelry store world. That'd be the people, screaming about blood diamonds and, unfair labor practices and spray painting the front of the jewelry store or knifing the tires on the delivery trucks. Sure. But APTs fit into this category almost like an Ocean's 11 type kind of group, right? Where they're going to do Cary Grant, right? Yeah, right. And they're not looking to just hit the jewelry store because that's the small potatoes. They want the repository where all the diamonds are stored, or where all the money is moving at the end of the week or the end of the month. And they're going to do that long-term reconnaissance. They're going to embed people into the jewelry company's mechanism, their security guards, or maybe evaluators or retail people or whatever. But they're going to embed themselves into that organization, and they're going to use that type of inside knowledge to figure out the best way to get the most out of the heist. And your APT, so we give them cute names like, Bear and Panda and Kitty and all those names, or we call them out by numbers, 28, 29, 32, etc. We give them these monikers to help them be identified because, they have specific TTPs and stuff. And those names kind of maybe take away from the seriousness, but they've evolved into a real threat, not just to the government organizations, but to any commercial industry and even individuals. So you mentioned some of the names that we kind of know them by, whether it be names or numbers or Ocean's 11. I certainly can appreciate that analogy. Who actually are we talking about in terms of APTs, and how have you seen them evolve from kind of the previous generation? Yeah, and so in a traditional sense, you're talking about nation state sponsored, cyber organizations, and if we were going to talk it in U.S. government parlance, we talk they're the offensive guys in those spaces, and originally it was the Chinese and the Russians, and then the North Koreans kind of came into it, and then you saw Iran, the North Koreans and Iran began to become part of this. And these are military-driven government organizations who not only have access to, what they bring to the table from a cyber capability, a tradecraft standpoint, but they also have access to all of those government assets, government intelligence, government fact-finding, government reach, government networks. And when you get into countries like Russia and China and North Korea, they're also able to leverage whatever commercial entities they see fit to be able to do it because of the way the governments run those countries. And in a criminal standpoint, you've got to start thinking about these criminal APTs because they are nearly as sophisticated. I don't want to say as sophisticated, but they're nearly as sophisticated, and they're profit-driven organizations. And so, but you're starting to see them pop up in India and Brazil, Ukraine, and other places. And that evolution for APTs. So look at them from a target standpoint. Originally, the APTs were definitely concentrated on government fact-finding. How do I get more information on the F-35 or the next nuclear submarine that's coming out? And reconnaissance, right? Yeah, and then how do I leverage that into my military technology stream? But then you saw them begin to evolve. You saw their target base evolve. And they started going after personnel, like the OPM hack, right? And then from a commercial standpoint, although I think I would probably have some pretty good debates with some of my compatriots in the cyberspace about organizations like DarkSide, but who have a business model, and would they be considered advanced persistent threat because of the way they do business? But they've set up all of those mechanisms. They've set up that intelligence gathering. They've set up, hell, they set up help desks and darks, in the darknet. And so they've evolved by broadening their target base. They've become much more disciplined on how they engage a target. They're doing reconnaissance for longer periods of time. They're re-verifying intelligence before they go after a target. They're much better resource than they used to be, because they're definitely not they're not a hobby anymore for the government organizations. And, and originally, I think they were, right. It was yeah. Is this really even?
It's an experiment. Yeah.
And you see how serious they take it. I mean, if for the U.S. government, cyberspace is a warfighting domain now. Just like airspace, and just like the ground and the sea. And so you see the seriousness that's come along with that in that time. And then the other thing about the APTs that a lot of times people don't take into account is they're not afraid to mix it with physical interaction. They're okay to make a phone call to act as somebody's secretary or executive agent, or even as another person, or mail out flyers to get somebody to log onto a website, or that actual true physical interaction of actually violating a target space. We think of it as a red team, but actually violating their space and visiting the organization that they're trying to get into. And so that doesn't happen often, because that's a magnificent increase in risk, but it's something all part of their playbook.
Right. I mean, the way that you're describing that, it makes me think of again, defining what, I think there's pretty clear examples of APTs. And I think that when you get to the criminal side of things, it's a little harder to kind of draw that distinction. Yeah. Sometimes I think it almost doesn't matter, but in terms of the physical world, it's easy to think of withdrawing cash from an ATM, for instance, or actually taking action, not being this kind of stereotype of a hacker that you see, in movies and TV shows.
Yeah, because it never works out like that. No.
Right.
But when you start thinking about the criminal elements, and DarkSide is a good example, and it's not just because they're in the news because of the Colonial Pipeline, but they set up a well-established setup that even defines the targets that they engage, right?
Sure.
And so they go after targets that they do reconnaissance on and go, you know what, they can afford to pay me based on the profit and revenue we made last year. So I know they can afford to pay me. And so that's when you look at and although their business is ransomware, you look at other organizations that do ransomware, one of the reasons they say, not to pay ransomware is because it incites that activity to do it again. But it's also because a lot of these organizations are amateurs.
Sure.
They've gotten access to technology that they're able to launch from dark space or from a darknet, and they don't necessarily, you don't necessarily get your return back. They may send you the wrong key to decrypt your drive or something like that. And so they fit back into that amateur space, even though they're using the same methodology as somebody like DarkSide. But they're definitely not in the same league.
Right. So you've kind of alluded to this, I think, a little bit, but we know that these groups have been around for, a long time, certainly. They continue to pose a threat. How have they managed to remain successful? Are they evolving with things? I mean, and why are these still such an issue? And there's dozens of them, right?
Yeah, there are. And so when you look at it, it's a professional organization. So any professional organization is looking down towards the future. One of the things that they do really well is they take the current news into account, right? So
sure.
Like the North Korean APTs, a lot of them have been latching on to COVID type mailers and COVID type information to latch on to somebody. Inside the United States, the Russian and Chinese APTs are all over the political spectrum, right? They're latching onto that and using that as leverage. And so as part of their reconnaissance, they're taking account into what the population they're targeting and what's important to them today, right? And it's because if my insert methodology or my triggering methodology is an email or a website, then I want to make sure that I can get that person to do that. And so they brought that social engineering to the next level. It's not just about using your Facebook page to try to figure out what your password is based on your dog's name and your kids' birthdays. It's about, how do I most influence you to become an interaction with my attack? Because the user will always be your weakest point. So taking it abreast of current times, and then we were talking about dark side a little bit, but also even with the nation state APTs, is they've developed business models that allow them to leverage resources from one activity to another. And so if I'm activating in any of the nation state environments, I may have somebody who's really, really good at smashing Windows boxes, and he's working an exploit, he or she's working an exploit to take out a bank or leverage going after Lockheed Martin for more, airframe. Right. But they'll take that asset and they'll leverage it somewhere else on another job, and so they're matrixing talent so they get the most bang for the buck out of their talent. And we're beginning to see, and the other piece that's really come into play is capitalizing on explicit trust of something. And what I mean by that is, right, so SolarWinds is a perfect example. And so I download a patch from SolarWinds, which is my trusted network management tool, and it's a trusted patch. And so, the bad guys injected code to manipulate that application, which is a powerful application because most of the people already using it are already network admins. They're already on the administration side of house. And so, but I trust that SolarWinds patch. I trust that patch.
It's an incredible move. Yeah.
And so those supply chain attacks are really, really dangerous because they're no longer a supply chain attack against a website and maybe supply chain is the wrong activity, the name for that. But, I'm no longer injecting myself as a man in the middle to going to a website. I'm actually affecting and manipulating software that you use and trust every day. And so that part is really dangerous. And they've been around for a little while, those supply chain attacks, but not at the level we're seeing them today.
I think it's hard for people to appreciate the significance of something like that. The idea that you would be downloading something from, the analogy is you would be downloading something from your own computer, looks totally legit. You're supposed to be updating your stuff anyway. Oh, actually, this was infected by suspected Russian spies, and now they're collecting all of your information. That's the equivalent of it. I know it's a little bit different, but what happens next, and how should we be thinking about kind of stopping some of this advanced activity into the future?
Yeah, and so I want to go back to your analogy real quick on the trusted software on the supply chain attack. So how many people, to put it in everyday users terms, how many people check all four of their tires on their car when they go out in the morning to start their car and drive away? How many people actually do that, right? So if someone swapped a bad tire in the middle of the night with the same rim on it, and you looked out and glanced, even if you glanced at your tire, you think, yeah, my car's fine, right? And 55 miles, the tire blows out. And so that's the everyday person's equivalent to that. Is you don't check that stuff every day, not the same way. And so what happens next? How do you stop these attacks in the future? And so nation state actors, they work off of a known methodology, right? And so the Lockheed Martin kill chain, although is old, is still really, it fits the bill, right? And so in order for me to attack a target, I have to recon the target, right? And after I recon the target, I pull to analogize John Wick, right? I go into my gun cabinet and I pull all the guns that I want, or I custom build my gun for my target, right? And then I have to deliver it, and then I have to exploit it, right? And I'm not going to go all the way down to the kill chain. And the reason I'm not going to go all the way down to the kill chain is because the best way to defeat adversaries like this is to make their research irrelevant, right? To break their assumptions, because I've made my assumptions. I scan the network. I see Windows 10. I see Red Hat. I see Red Hat 8. I see McAfee. I see these tools. I see these names. But breaking that analogy, they're breaking that assumption that they've done this scan of your environment. They've scanned it. Right. They think they know what is there. So there are technologies out there, randomization technologies, moving target defense, obfuscation technologies that help break those assumptions, because I've scanned the environment, but when I go to launch my exploit on what I think I know, it breaks. And so when you're talking about the kill chain, you're talking in between that delivery and exploitation piece, you're talking about breaking that link. And so that does a couple of things, right? And so so when you break those assumptions, it still is a resource-driven business. And although, like I think I read the other day that like the United States has like 500,000 open cybersecurity positions, those positions are going to be open for a long time because not everybody does this work. And it's okay, not everybody wants to do this work, but not everybody does this work. Well, the same for us applies in Russia, in China, in Vietnam, wherever. The same thing applies. And so if you force the bad guys to continually have to go back into that reconnaissance mode, you're increasing risk, which means they're not so much inclined to necessarily want to go after that target. The other thing you're doing is you're forcing them to apply more resources to that. So you're making it more expensive, either from a manpower or actually cost perspective, but you're making it more expensive, right? So to level that playing field, because right now they have the advantage. I buy one exploit, or I build one exploit for one Windows box or one Red Hat box or whatever, and I hit tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of targets. But with those technologies, some of those randomization technologies, encryption technologies, and things like that, I begin to break that. I break that one to many, and I try to get it as close to a one-to-one as I can. And so that the bad guys have to be right as often as I have to be right, right? And so they always hear it say, well, the bad guys only have to be right once, but the defender has to be right every time. Well, with the right technology and the processes and with the right people, if you can get that closer to a one-to-one, then all of a sudden it's an even playing field. And now if all of their targets are that one-to-one, it becomes really expensive for them to do business. And then and so to be honest, in my bet, I want to be that harder target. I want to be the house with the big fence and the big dog and the sign that says, my dog can run from zero to the fence in 2 seconds. Can you, right? I want to be that house. I want them to look at the house. I don't want to
the
go
stronger
there.
jewelry store, if you will. Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. And so I think that's part of it is forcing their reconnaissance not to be right. Breaking their assumptions forces them to redo a lot of things, which increases their risk of getting caught.
Ron Nixon, we could talk about this all day, but this has been a great conversation. Thank you again for joining us. We'll be sure to talk to you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
coming up next.
Hi there, welcome back to CyberTalks. Thank you for joining us for our fireside chat about authentication, zero trust, and the White House executive order. I'm Jeff Stone, the editor-in-chief at Cyberscoop, and I'm glad to be joined by Helen Patton, advisory CISO for Duo, which is now part of Cisco. Helen, thank you for being here. Help us understand what it means when people say zero trust is a philosophy rather than the latest buzzword, if you will.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, zero trust isn't a product. It's not something that you can just go buy straight off the shelf, number one. Number two, it's really not a state you can ever actually achieve and be done with. It's not a project that you can just start and finish on. So when someone's thinking about zero trust, they have to start by thinking, what do I have now that looks like zero trust, which is the ability to really validate authentication at the time of authentication, to validate who the user is, the device they're on, the network, whatever a company decides they want to pay attention to, but to make that determination about whether access should be given and to what degree it should be given at the time of authentication. So what would somebody have already that might enable that kind of decision making in real time? And then what do they need to add to their technology stack or their security stack that would facilitate doing that even better? And then, of course, as technology changes, as it always does, how does that then need to be adopted and adapted to by the security team? So it's definitely not a product. It is a philosophy and it's a lifestyle, frankly.
I take your point. It's not the kind of thing where you are going to change your password or go through a quick reset. Oh, you're done for now. No, it's going to be a longer process, a totally different mentality. So
sure.
One of the things that's particularly significant or stands out to me, tell me if I'm wrong, is that the White House executive order about software security specifically mentions zero trust. What does that mean to you?
I think it's really interesting. I think it's the first time I've seen an official document from the White House and from really any of the federal agencies that name it. We know NIST has come out with a zero trust standard description, but this is really the first time it's been instructed to be operationalized at the federal government. And that means, of course, anybody who does work with the federal government or anybody who does work with someone who does work with the federal government is going to have to come along for the ride. So it's really, I think, a way of helping the whole community step up into a more secure posture, which I think is great. But devil's always in the details. So I think we've got some watch and wait and see to see how the federal government goes about doing it, what elements of zero trust they really emphasize. Because again, it's not just one thing. Where do they start? Where do they really put their effort? It'll be interesting to watch and see where it goes for sure.
It's the kind of thing that could have a ripple effect, whether that be through smaller governments or
that's right.
Corporate America. But it's an important thing. Do you have any other observations from the executive order? Anything else that stands out to you?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. Two things. They required federal agencies to very quickly go in and implement MFA, multi-factor authentication, and encryption as sort of two immediate steps that need to be taken. I think most federal agencies would have MFA to some degree already. So I think it's not a question of beginning, but really sort of saying, do we have it everywhere where it needs to be? So that was interesting to me, number one. The second thing in the executive order that I also thought was interesting was the discussion around the software bill of materials. And there is going to be a lot more work coming out of both the federal government as well as security tools, services, companies, and the entire defense industrial line to make sure that they have a software bill of materials, that it's consumable, and that it's operationalized. There is a lot to unpack in that. And again, watch this space, because I think every federal agency has a different idea of what a software bill of materials is. So that's going to have to be rationalized before I think we can really make it ubiquitous. So we'll see what happens, but I think it's a great step.
We'll see. It could take years likely for this to kind of be fully absorbed, but it sounds, based on your description, encouraging.
Yeah.
How common in your experience is multi-factor authentication among companies and agencies now?
I think it's reasonably common, but not extensive throughout an organization. So I think most companies, whether they're federal agencies or private sector institutions, have multi-factor to some degree in some places. Typically, what I've seen is they've started by implementing multi-factor on applications and systems that have an externally facing protocol. So the question will be, if you've got that taken care of, what things that are internal to your network do you want to now put multi-factor in front of? And again, if you go back to a zero trust philosophy, you're going to say pretty much everything. But is that going to be feasible given your budget and so forth? And can you do everything overnight, or do you have to have a long-term strategy for your rollout? So we'll see where it goes. But yeah, I think companies have it somewhere, but probably don't have it everywhere it needs to be. And that's where I think the journey is now.
We know it's the kind of thing that can prevent account takeovers and really just give you a little bit of a peace of mind. I'll speak for myself, for not worrying constantly that someone is going to kind of steal your password, or you're using QWERTY as your password and somebody's going to exploit that. Do you have advice on how more organizations might try to implement that a little bit more aggressively?
So yeah, in terms of implementing MFA, I would definitely be putting it in front of any messaging system you have. So whether that's your email, whether that's sort of any sort of chat functions that you have, particularly again, if those things go outside the boundaries of your organization and allow for guests or contractors to come into, that would be a place. I think there's also other things that are a little bit easier to implement, perhaps in a central way, that might add onto the multi-factor experience. And those are things like being able to check for compromised passwords and forcing a password reset if you know someone's password has ended up in a dark website or that kind of thing. So I think there are free services that allow companies to check for that kind of thing. And I would encourage companies to take advantage of that for sure.
Helen, so much of when I think about passwords, it feels like the kind of thing that should have been solved like 10 years ago, right?
Yeah,
it's
right.
the kind of thing that we know this is problematic and we know that it's risky. It just is a legacy in many ways.
Yeah.
Give us an example of the kind of behavior that more people might start to experience as more organizations start to adopt newer forms of authentication. I'm asking you in a really clumsy way what the ripple effects might be.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of positive ripple effects. So if we think about emerging technologies like passwordless, which by the way, don't mean no passwords anywhere, but being able to use biometrics and so forth, instead of having to remember upper or lower 15 characters, special character, whatever. If we go to a passwordless kind of model, I think it does make it easier for an end user to get done what they need to get done, to get into systems and so forth, right? Which is great. On the other hand, we know that there is a lot of shadow password sharing that happens, particularly amongst the consumer side of the house, perhaps less so with employees in an organization. But password sharing happens a lot, particularly if you're in a situation where you have aging parents or young children, or you're financially responsible for someone. Password sharing happens a lot. Just don't even get started on social media accounts. If we start implementing stronger security authentication protocols that really get down to identifying the individual user, I think companies and government agencies are also going to have to provide ways of delegating access to authorized users who can then use biometrics and passwordless situations. And those things actually don't exist very easily right now. So I think there's functionality that's going to need to happen, or I think people will opt out. And so we're going to have to be careful we don't squeeze the balloon on one end just to have insecurity pop out the other end. It'll be an interesting journey to watch for sure.
It sounds like you're largely optimistic. How do you expect this conversation to change or evolve or progress over the next 6 months or a year?
Yeah. I'll tell you why I'm optimistic. I think I'm optimistic because people are engaging in the conversation. They're not just saying, this security thing, it's a tech thing, just let the techies work it out, and then really hate the result because they weren't engaged in the beginning. I think there is a community conversation happening around privacy. I think there's a community conversation understanding now that cybersecurity can impact things like critical resources that we all use, up to and including, food supply and so forth. So I think we've got the right people at the table with their attention, and I think that can only be a good thing. It will make it slower, and I think we're going to have to understand that as well. But I think the end result's going to be better. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and really seeing what comes out of it. I think we're at a time where security professionals before were like, don't ignore me. And, well, now we're not being ignored. So how can we capitalize on that opportunity?
Some of the costs from that ignoring are starting to turn up in really big ways. So
yes, that's right.
I think that's a very real thing. Helen Patton, unfortunately we're out of time, but thank you again for joining us. Great to have you. We'll look forward to bugging you with more questions again in the future.
Thanks so much.
Coming up next.
Hi, I'm Sean Lingus, a senior reporter with CyberScoop. I'm here today with an illustrious panel of guests to talk about ransomware, a threat that needs no introduction. With me today from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency is Don Banak, who is Associate Director of Vulnerability Management, Dan Donahue, Special Agent of Homeland Security Investigations at the Department of Homeland Security, and Stephen Nix, Assistant Special Agent at the U.S. Secret Service. Like I said, ransomware, it is throughout the headlines today, from the Colonial Pipeline attack to much earlier in the pandemic, where ransomware actors were routinely targeting hospital networks in the US and around the world. Today's panel is going to dive into some of the thornier challenges in combating ransomware and talk about some solutions. Thanks for being with us all. My first question is for Don. As you do vulnerability assessments with companies as part of your work with CISA, what's some of the most effective methods that you use to convince executives to invest more in cybersecurity? And what are some recurring vulnerabilities and sort of attack vectors that you see ransomware actors exploiting?
Okay, thanks for having me here. It's not a consistent set of findings. I'll tackle the findings first. We tend to see a couple common challenges organizations have, and it's various permutations of these almost in every assessment we do. There's either trouble with network segmentation or leveraging the principle of least privilege or multi-factor authentication or sufficient backups. And it's various challenges. I mean, those are kind of the big four that we see a lot of, or the fifth one that I really can't emphasize enough is either running unpatched or unsupported software. So that legacy software that's just not either being maintained or kept up to date and patched. So those are the things we see a lot of. In terms of ransomware specifically, how organizations are being victimized, it typically starts out through the user. And it's just the reality. It's the adversaries in this case only have to be correct once. We have to be perfect all the time to avoid ransomware. And I guess in terms of how do we convince organizations to make the investment in cybersecurity, I guess the first thing is trying to get organizational leadership to look at cybersecurity as an investment in capability that'll help them deliver services consistently, reliably. So that's kind of the first thing, is getting them to just recognize that it's not necessarily cost center. It's enabling capability, and looking at that as an investment. And part of it, recent events have shown, the direct costs of just the ransom itself are at the point now where it's not hard math to understand that a couple dollars invested proactively are going to avoid significant ransoms and ransom payouts that in some cases, the costs are getting to the point where certain businesses, smaller businesses, might be run straight out of business. And then, the second thing is, because what we do is penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, usually the proof is in the pudding. Once our teams are on site and engaged, as you're showing the levels of access and disruption that are possible, it's an easier sell to show the corresponding mitigations and offsetting controls that can help mitigate and minimize the disruption. So that's that's what we do persistently.
Absolutely. And do you think the headlines, I imagine, are making it more tangible to some of the people that you work with? I mean, your penetration test can certainly help reinforce the point, but now with Colonial Pipeline being on the nightly news, the reminders are less necessary, perhaps.
Yes, certainly the public conscious is raised to the point where I think everybody's really starting to get it and see tangible impacts of the scourge that is ransomware. So absolutely.
Great. And then Dan and Steve, you're both on the more investigative side, and that has obviously an important role in all this, whereas Don is on some of the mitigation, prevention, and recovery. I'm wondering, first Dan and then Steve, perhaps, if you could talk about how you overcome any lingering reluctance on the behalf of on victim organizations who this may be their first rodeo, their first time dealing with a ransomware incident, and they're not used to interacting necessarily with law enforcement in this manner. But yet it's crucial that they do, and that they are forthcoming with all the incident data they have. How do you overcome that reluctance, that stigma?
I think the most important thing is outreach, just letting these companies know that we're there, the services we provide, reassuring them that any information they give us is law enforcement use only. This is something that we're going to broadcast to the entire world. And also being a little bit proactive is one of the programs that we have at Homeland Security Investigations is actually scanning for threats, notifying companies, and then actually doing follow-up. It's not just sending an email and walking away. We have some of our people at our cybercrime center that will, reach out to these companies that are potential victims and, establish that relationship and talk them through mitigating any potential vulnerabilities that we might find.
Steve, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I just want to add that, why is the Secret Service on this? And the Secret Service has been around since 1865, protecting the financial infrastructure of the United States. And that's perfect where we're working now. This is a money crime. And when we talk about who's looking at the two separate entities, is the technical aspect, the malware, the signature, and how these suspects are getting in, but it's also where is the money flow. And the Secret Service is the one tasked with tracking those financial infrastructure issues. Now, why report and why not report is, first and foremost, we're not on you never see us or HSI or CISA on the news saying this person is a victim of this crime. So there is that anonymity when you speak to us, that we're going to safeguard that information. Because when you give us that information, when you can, relay that, yes, you've been attacked, talk to us about the ransomware. Although we across the board will say, do not pay the ransom, we're telling you don't pay the ransom. We're in this boat we're in now because over the last several years, people have paid the ransom, and it's come to the conclusion that this is the monetization of security flaws. That's what we're looking at. So that horse has left the barn. Ransom has been paid. There's research and development. So where are we going? If you report, if you let us understand that you are hit and that you are making a payment, and tell us the wallet and tell us the IPs, we can utilize that for attribution. And we can utilize that to say in the long road, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is what could occur. We can help you say, yes, there's a decryptor. No, there's not a decryptor. Or yes, they're going to send you the decryption tool, but it's not going to work for your systems. We don't know if you don't tell us. And I think it's a very small number of cases we actually hear about. We hear about new ones every day. But if we don't hear about it, we can't help you, and we can't help the next person.
I know you don't know what you don't know, but do you have any kind of sense of the percentage of victims who don't report to law enforcement?
I would, just based on what I say, I would say it's less than half. And that's a high number. So I think we know less than half of what actually occurs.
Yeah. So those are good points, because you can't tackle something you're not seeing. And we're starting to get greater visibility, but it's a gradual process. On the investigative side, I want to stay with Dan and Steve and ask you how you deal with some of the psychological aspects of some of these ransomware attacks. As you all know, attackers have moved to sort of a double extortion technique where before they encrypt the data, they exfiltrate some of it so as to use, if necessary, and a shakedown via public websites that where they leak data claiming to be victim data. So how does that complicate how you approach an investigation, and how do you manage that aspect of sort of panic that tends to set in among certain victims when they see that their data has not only been encrypted but gone out the door first?
I think.
Go ahead, Dan.
I was gonna say, I think a lot of times it's just providing them some information. I think if you went back to 2018, responding to some of these incidents, people had no idea what ransomware is. There's a little bit more public information out there, but people, by and large, kind of are still in the dark. And I think just kind of talking to them, through the process, how these things tend to work, that provides a little bit of comfort, although not much, because these people are being extorted. But even looking at the different threat actor profiles, being able to provide information about, well, if you do actually pay the ransom, is this decryptor going to work? Like, what is the likelihood that you're able to recover a certain percentage of your data? Things like that can actually lessen some of the stress.
Steve, did you want to jump in there?
I would also agree that what Dan is saying, and also the attribution. Once, let's say we do see some of these wallets where these ransoms are paid, if the victim hasn't contacted us, hasn't spoken to us, and we haven't gone through this, we can't actually get attribution. And if these funds are seized and returned to victims, they're not the ones who are going to get it if we don't know about it. So that's partial. And we understand that there are desires to pay the ransom. We understand that maybe your backups aren't up to speed, but we do need to be involved, and we need to at least talk through it and see what we've seen. Because sadly, we've been this. We've seen, we've spoken to hundreds of victims, all of us separately. Mm-hmm. So we know what they're going through, but we also know that there's a path forward and a way out.
Right. So this next question is for everyone, and because the U.S. government, leading with law enforcement and the FBI, but really the whole U.S. government has made it publicly clear that they want to impose more consequences on ransomware gangs, and it's never been more acute, the demand for that in the wake of Colonial Pipeline. So I wanted to ask each of you, starting with Don, other than putting these actors in handcuffs, which obviously would in some cases be an optimal solution for you because they can't operate keyboards when they're in cuffs. But other than that, what can be done what is the most effective way to put a dent in this problem and stem the tide of ransomware incidents? And we'll start with Don.
Okay. And I'm going to quickly defer back to my law enforcement peers, but aside from making sure you have the minimum essentials in place that are going to help prevent and mitigate the impacts of ransomware, it's going to come down to, and this is why I'm going to pivot right back to Secret Service and HSI, disruption of the economic incentive chain, and whether that's sanctions against the accounts or whatever tools Secret Service has in their belt and Treasury has in their belt to really impose economic impact to disrupting that payment system. That's going to be the biggest thing, because it's a business. It's commoditized and it's scalable. And it's going to have to come down to the economics, I think.
Absolutely right. This is shared criminal infrastructure. So just like any business, any franchisees, that's what variants are. They're a franchise of some of these original ransom attacks. We have to attack all of it. The customer service aspect, the money laundering aspect. That's where the Secret Service jumps in, is let us look and see, let us know the wallets, let's track that. We're working with Treasury, we work with OFAC. We can go after these money service businesses. There are over 500 money service businesses in the United States alone that handle cryptocurrency. At any one point, that some of these ransom funds could be mixed or tumbled through some of these money exchangers. Can't do anything we don't know about it.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what everybody else said, is targeting infrastructure, is that these are kind of distributed networks, is that you have people that are money launderers, the affiliates that are basically selling access as a service, the developers, the people that are malware testers to make sure that their particular variant of ransomware isn't picked up by common antivirus. You have to take all the bricks to take them out of the wall to make this actually effective. And the other thing is education. I think we've mentioned that before, is that the more people know, and the harder that we make targets, removing some of the low-hanging fruit, it might actually increase the cost of doing business and make these things a little bit more prohibitive.
I want to go back to Don real quickly, because talking more from a CISA perspective, because of the visibility you have in terms of vulnerability assessments and work with the private sector. A lot of people right now tend to think of this as an overwhelming problem. How could organizations possibly keep up with criminal gangs that are kind of crowdsourcing their tools and going after the weakest link? But I wanted you to talk a little bit about, if you could, about how to do that, in the sense that, a security assessment and a follow-up services that you provide and that others provide and that aren't necessarily cost prohibitive can really make a difference in terms of cutting into this problem. I wondered if you could just reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'll take a quick second to talk about a couple of products on the CISA website. That's our ransomware guide. It was a joint multi-agency produced document, and our cyber essentials, both available on CISA's website. And those, both the guide and the essentials documents, the essentials toolkit that are out there, were derived guidance looking across our thousands of incident response and vulnerability assessments we've done over years, and looking at what are, it's in the name, the bare minimum essentials that all organizations can do to help mitigate and harden themselves against ransomware. And there are some very easy things that can be done. If I had to pick a couple of the most essential essentials, first and foremost, it's making sure that you have backups, versioned backups that are stored either offline or offsite, so that you can pick a restore point closest to the point of ransomware, so that it's an easier recovery, right? It's a more seamless restore those critical systems and data, so that you can continue operations and potentially avoid paying the ransomware. Now, I know the privacy impacts and the pivot towards ransoming to not have information disclosed is kind of a new twist to that, but at least being able to get your billing systems and customer systems back up and delivering services. Backups are going to be key, because again, it's that one slip up opens the door for a world of hurt, and being able to recover, that's your first best defense. After that, there are a couple additional simple things that can be done. Making sure you're aggressively patching, and particularly if you have unsupported software, so software that's at end of life or beyond end of life, replacing it with supported software, but aggressively patching your environment. Looking at something like protected DNS, which there are a number of free services, there are commercial services, but this is disrupting the command and control. So if a user does click in your organization on a known malware link, that connection won't get established. The DNS resolver just won't translate that malicious URL into an IP address, and we disrupt the command and control. And it's effective about 30% of known malware cases, so it can really reduce the volume. Making sure that you've engaged your users to understand what phishing is, and that they know how to identify it, or at least, if not identify it, where to report it when they do come across something suspicious, or they do click on something and something suspicious happens. And those are just a few of the essentials. But if you can focus on just those, it'll make a world of difference. And then CISA does have some services available to the masses to help with that. We have, you can email a request into the CISA Central Service Desk, or to vulnerability at CISA.dhs.gov. We have cyber hygiene vulnerability scanning services, where we'll do external scanning on a continuing ongoing basis. You authorize us to look. It's a non-credentialed scan, but it'll give you a good feel for your perimeter and vulnerabilities present there. We have a phishing assessment, where we can help raise user awareness and educate around phishing, what phishing looks like, and the perils of phishing. So we have a couple of services available to everybody that can help with that. But definitely, if you get a chance to go to the website, the ransomware guide and the cyber essentials toolkit are great starting points. And it's not a high bar. The bar is relatively low for things you can do that'll help. Right. No, those are good points. And this ecosystem changes so often. It's hard to keep track. We've talked about ransomware as a service for a couple of years now, at least, where like the dark side gang, you have a central team of operators of the ransomware, developers, and then you have quote unquote affiliates who are pay for access to it, and then the operators take a cut.
if we do this panel a year from now, I bet we'll be talking about a different phenomenon in ransomware because of the evolution of it. So I wanted to get each of your takes on what is next in ransomware. What are we going to be talking about in terms of impactful dynamics in ransomware attacks in the coming months, and how do we prepare for that? We'll start with Steve and then go down the line.
Well, I appreciate it. And I mean, just like we diversify our stock, if we have stock, the ransomware actors are diversifying their illicit cyber access assets also. They're looking for the next, low-hanging fruit. And sadly, phishing is not going away. I used to say back when I started this in 2004 that, the weakest link is somebody's grandmother hitting a nice little photo that their grandchild sent to them, because that is how basic it has gotten, that you have to secure all the way to the very least common denominator of every system. So what's next is what we've already seen, and that is phishing, phishing, phishing. Now, what's the future of cryptocurrency and the moving of the platforms of Monero to Bitcoin? I mean, that's going to cause issues for everyone in the long term. And then nation state currency valuation, that's going to be important. So to me, the future is cryptocurrency and the security and anonymity of cryptocurrency exchanges.
Yeah, let's tease that out a little bit. Dan, do you want to elaborate on the cryptocurrency challenge? If there's some currencies that are more difficult to trace than others.
Yeah, so not all cryptocurrencies are created equal. Monero is a little bit harder to trace. You'll see some of these people when they actually drop their ransom notes, they'll advertise that you pay a premium if you pay in Bitcoin. So if you pay in Monero, the ransom will be a little bit less, because these threat actors obviously know that it's just another roadblock in the way of law enforcement actually providing attribution. In terms of other trends, again, you've seen it with the recent attack on the, I believe it was the Irish National Health Service, where they provided a decryption key but still tried to extort the victims. You saw Colonial Pipeline threat actors, DarkSide Group, releasing a statement saying that they were not political. You saw recently one of our local law enforcement agencies right here in Washington, D.C. was extorted, and the group behind it promptly said that they were getting out of the business, releasing their source code so other people can start their own ransomware as a service type schemes. So it seems like sunlight is the best disinfectant, that sometimes the targets for these big game hunters might be a little bit too big. I think you might see some of the more well-established actors pivot away from things like healthcare and government sector and target things like retail and manufacturing. And that, some of the more established actors might eventually just kind of exit the game and, pass it on to the next group of ambitious young cyber criminals. So I think there will be an expansion of ransomware. I don't think it's going away. Like it was already mentioned, you could have the perfectly configured network, and then you still have to factor in the human element, and then there's always going to be zero-day vulnerabilities. So it's going to be difficult.
Good points. And Don, I wanted to ask you in terms of this, what are in terms of defensive measures, what do you want to see a greater focus on in the future? I mean, we talked about taking away some of those public-facing vulnerabilities and some of the easier ones to shore up. Once an organization has done that, should they look to do after that? Absolutely,
and that's where we start getting into some of the more intermediate to advanced capabilities within the ransomware guide and in the toolkit itself. Things like a properly segmented network, so that if there is a toehold gained through a user, the scope and magnitude of what can be encrypted and what can be ransomed is limited. So things like network segmentation, multi-factor authentication, moving towards a zero trust architecture, things that are going to really rely on authenticating the transactions to the data and the user engaging in those transactions. Those are going to start layering on beyond the low-hanging fruit. But this is, right now it still feels like it's kind of a game of, you don't have to be faster than the bear, you have to be faster than the guy next to you. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And I don't know how much the adversaries and the organizations that are economically motivated are going to go into the more advanced attack pathways.
Right.
until we've shored up the essentials. But that, I mean, that's not to say multi-factor authentication isn't important. It is. It'll definitively help. Zero trust definitely helps. So I don't want to downplay those as not necessary. They're absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. Just saying, even with those, I'm not sure how much the tactics are going to change in terms of the exploitation vectors, just because the users are still the gateway key. It's all about helping your users, and when they make mistakes, having technologies in place, they're going to mitigate those very natural human mistakes and human tendencies.
We're running up against time, so I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to kick it to Steve. During the recent Colonial saga, the pipeline incident, there was a lot of focus, unprecedented focus, on the payment of ransoms. And as you know, law enforcement has long advised victims not to pay the ransom. But in recent years, law enforcement has said, well, if you do pay the ransom, we'd like to hear about it because it helps tracking some of these threat actors, and it gives us data to work with. So can you talk a little bit about that, how there's a kind of a budding group of middlemen, of companies that negotiate ransom payments and facilitate this sort of thing. How do you draw on data like that from credible third parties?
Well, and that's the good thing about cryptocurrency is the blockchain is an open book. Anybody can have access to it. Anybody can look at that. So if a victim does pay a ransom, that's one of the issues is, is there a kill chain where we can start blocking some of these ransom payments? And is that something we really want to do? If you pay a ransom and then we block it, or, the kill chain blocks it, but then you don't get your decryptor, that's going to cause multiple issues. There are OFAC warnings saying that you cannot pay certain illegitimate corporations who do this. The problem is, how do you know that? How do you know who this is that you're paying? You don't. Most of the time, you have no clue where that wallet that was given to you that you're paying. So maybe you need to ask that. Maybe you do need to contact. And we have excellent communication with a lot of the folks in that sector, insurance companies, these third-party companies that speak to us on a daily basis, saying, hey, just so you know, this looks like it's coming down the pike. What can you tell us about it? And we'll gladly tell them. This is what we've seen from this variant. We've seen that they're going to exfil your data and then do a double extortion technique. Or we'll say, hey, they're going to ask for the moon, but you can pay them much lower on that. Mm-hmm. Now, is that something, that's beneficial? It very well could be, but we have to know, and you have to tell us, and then we'll answer those questions.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. Unfortunately, we're out of it. Appreciate your insights, and to the viewers, I hope you enjoy the rest of CyberTalks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up next.
Hello, welcome back to CyberTalks. I'm Jeff Stone, Editor-in-Chief at CyberScoop, and I'm glad to be joined today by Travis Rosick, the Chief Technology and Strategy Officer at Blue Vector. Travis, thank you for being here. You previously were involved in the military. There's been some action lately toward a National Transportation Safety Board style group that might investigate a data breach in a similar way to an aviation accident typically is examined today. Do you have any thoughts based on your experience on how something like that might work or otherwise be successful?
Sure. Pleasure to be here today speaking with you, Jeff. Very excited for the opportunity. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I spent the first half of my career in cybersecurity as a government employee supporting the military. And during one of my assignments, I created a branch that analyzed and collected cybersecurity metrics and data and did essentially NTSB-like work for cyber breaches. Right. So that's the reactive side. The proactive side was measuring cyber readiness of the different military COCOM servicing agencies. From an NTSB-like approach, why did this breach happen? What was the breakdown? So some of the key components that we use for evaluation were the people aspect, processes, technologies. So essentially from a people perspective, do they have enough? Do they have the right skill sets? Do they know the environment? Do they have enough tool training? Things like that. From a process perspective, do all the different underlying components of the organization work well together? Do they have a cohesive way to collaborate? And one of the harder problems in cybersecurity is triaging an event or an unknown event to determine if it's good or bad. To me, that's one of the hardest problems that is still left to be solved, and one of the things that we're currently working on in my day job today. But essentially, trying to rapidly triage that event, how do you coordinate with the other components of your organization? Do you wake up the CEO or the general or admiral, tell them there's a breach? When do you notify the customers?
Right.
In some cases, large organizations have the IT teams and the security teams don't get along, or they're completely different contracts. It's a challenge or not really allowed for a contractor to task a contractor. So it's something as simple as asking a question if something belongs. That's not really how the system's designed for. So when you get into doing the incident response or these assessments, you start figuring out, well, there's a lot of barriers to be able to do that rapidly. So that's some of the process perspective. And on the technology perspective, there's a couple folds, a couple things to think about. One is the tools that you're currently buying, and this is one aspect. The DoD spends, tremendous amount of money for cybersecurity tools. Are the tools you're paying for and the requirements that they are written for, do they actually work, right? Do we need to go back and update the requirements? Or is a vendor not delivering a capability we thought that they delivered? So there's a few different aspects that we used to do in that use case. So really the combination of people, process, and technologies was the core foundation of trying to figure out what happened. And then the remediation of that is more training, more funding for resources, looking at processes. If you don't have an incident response plan, or you've never practiced it or done tabletop exercises, during a real incident is not the time to dust it off and hope it works, because it never works. Same for backups and things like that as well. Most people don't test their COOP or data recovery plans, so they usually fail when it comes time to actually needing it. So, and then the technology side, is the other aspect. So maybe there needs to be a policy change. Maybe there needs to be new training programs, new programs of record to go buy new capabilities, or a problem for DARPA. So essentially what we used to do is cover that whole gamut, and it was quite rewarding. I actually like that kind of work.
I believe that. I mean, it seems like difficult, tricky, nuanced work, but if you're able to do it successfully, I can imagine it would be a very satisfying thing. I also take your point about the idea of not waiting until you've been breached or there's a ransomware hacker, for instance, in your system to kind of figure out what you're going to do in that situation. Right. Easier said than done, probably. But part of this, I think, is we hear so much about public and private sector information sharing. You just outlined a lot of the challenges that even well-intentioned people go through when they're trying to resolve an incident. When it comes to data protection more broadly and dealing with threats, how would you assess the current state of information sharing and how it might work better in the future if that's necessary?
Sure, that's a great question. Yeah, so I definitely have seen a lot of good, bad, and ugly over the years. So some things keep me up at night still. So that's how ugly they were. But yeah, from the information sharing, collaboration is key. Organizations collaborating, brainstorming, trying to find ways to solve problems. Not just cybersecurity, but every facet of life that's uber critical. I think when it comes down to cybersecurity and information sharing today, we're kind of, I fear in general, fighting the last battle, right? We're really gearing up to sharing more of information that's been around for a long time. And the adversaries are continuing to adapt and evolve their tactics, techniques, and procedures. They're using artificial intelligence to help stage attacks, to create targeted spear fishes, things like that. On the defensive side of things, compliance requirements don't really mandate or enforce or give organizations the teeth they need to actually go above and beyond basic compliance requirements or signature-based technology. So the adversaries are rapidly it's kind of an arms race, right? So the adversaries are winning the arms race at scale, while they don't have rules to follow. So from the information sharing perspective, historically, sharing signatures about past attacks or past tools and getting them out to industry or the private sector has been kind of the way of life for a decade or more now. And there's a lot of inherent challenges that have evolved over this cat and mouse game over the last 15 years. You know, adversaries before would try to find ways to, you know, beat some of that signature-based detection. So eventually they started recompiling their tools, changing, you know, C2 callback domains, things like that to bypass or defeat signatures. So they would do that maybe on a weekly basis or something like that. On the cybersecurity side of things, signature creation and propagation, you know, instead of on a daily basis, maybe on an hourly basis, things like that. From a public to private partnership sharing program, the government getting authority to share the data with private sector, you know, going back to that people, process, technology component I talked about before, there's a lot of bureaucracy, process, delay built in, non-technical into that process of just sharing the data. When organizations get it in the private sector, there's a propagation time from them to ingest it. Some solutions or tools in their environment can't automatically ingest signatures for fear of disrupting systems and, you know, things like that. So it's not a, they shared it, so we're mitigated or inoculated, so to speak. So right. Taking out all those inherent barriers, the adversaries for targeted attacks now almost recompile their tools, or they're staging their attacks and TTPs uniquely for every targeted attack. So I think to some degree, over-reliance of signature sharing programs in the government to bail you out is fighting the last war when the adversary is, you know, doing a 180 and operating completely differently. So I think trying to find ways that don't rely on signatures to do better detection is really the wave of the future. And having government organizations help curate and foster maybe industry vertical type of models, machine learning algorithms, classifiers, things like that, that have a much longer half-life, right? So they maybe work for months or years without having an update, versus a signature maybe has a half-life of seconds or minutes. So I think, you know, evolving and advancing technically what is shared in that partnership, what will be key into its success in the future.
That's I take your point that we have all of this threat information, right, about these targeted attacks that are happening almost instantaneously, certainly regularly. It's difficult for a number of reasons for the government to share that information, and it's difficult for large organizations to know that they are adequately protected, because so much of this is inherently reactive. We know that this is a malicious software strain that was problematic in the past. It's harder to know that in the future. How do you make that shift? And are companies or government agencies or other organizations starting to think that through? Is there anything to be optimistic about in this regard?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. There are some successes. There are you know, emerging technologies, you know, like Blue Vector, that is leveraging things that aren't reliant on signatures. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, capabilities that don't rely on signatures. They can analyze and render decisions rapidly. So, you know, in the case we're talking, ransomware is very prevalent in the news today and very disruptive. You know, ransomware to me isn't overly scary, right? So to me, it's a form of malware. Malware has been pretty prevalent in general the last 20 years. You know, so the adversary getting access to your system, the adversary implanting malware on your device, you know, that hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is the motive of the adversary. So to me, it's not really any more scary than it has been. It's more, what is their intent and what are they operating as? So, you know, in simple Windows speak, kind of the adversary, you know, from an espionage is copying your data from your device, you know, and in more the destructive nature, it's, deleting your data, right? So they have access, they can do whatever they want. They're just choosing to, interact with your data differently. From a criminal perspective, this opens up, Pandora's box as far as how many more people would be interested in making profit from it. So, but in all of those cases, that's a very clear and direct motive. So once they get access to your systems, they're going to act really quickly, right? It's not like they're going to sit there for months or years, like a nation state from an espionage perspective and watch what they're doing or pre-positioning for, some follow-on action if and when something might occur. In this case, they have a very clear motive is to make money. And when they get access to your system, they're going to maximize it. So you really won't have the time, a lot of breaches, 9 months after the fact that, it happens. In destructive malware, ransomware, it's, that's not the case. You find out about it when the system stops working. So, you've got to be able to detect and do something about it rapidly if you want to have a chance.
Why is it beneficial to know about it sooner?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So if you know that there's a piece of malware or something coming into your environment or on your system, it doesn't happen instantaneous. There are, it does have to, sometimes they gain access. Sometimes they try to create, legitimate credentials in your environment. Sometimes they like to steal your data first and then encrypt it. So there is a little bit of a time buffer. If you can detect it when it's coming into your environment in milliseconds, that gives you a time to come back. Maybe the user hasn't opened the attachment, but you see it coming in, right? There's a chance that you can come and disrupt it or minimize the broad impact within your organization. So, once they get in, they try to spread laterally in the environment. So maybe you can reduce the collateral damage. Maybe you can minimize the impact, not only to your organization, but your customers. So as we've seen recently, the consumers in the US were dramatically impacted with ransomware. And I would say a vast majority had no clue what ransomware was until they saw their bill at the gas pump. So.
Right, their bill at the pump or on cable news. I mean, it's
the grocery store. Yeah.
Right. We'll certainly start seeing more of it. I think that's safe to say. Travis, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I could ask you 40 more questions about this, but we will release you to the rest of your day. Thank you again for joining us, and looking forward to next time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I'm Tanya Ugoretz, the FBI's Deputy Assistant Director for Cyber Policy, Intelligence, and Engagement. I'd like to thank CyberScoop for inviting me to speak at this year's CyberTalks. When I last spoke at CyberTalks this past October, the FBI's cyber division was focused on ensuring that no adversary used cyber intrusions to interfere in our elections, and I'm proud of how the FBI, CISA, state and local election officials, and our private sector partners work together on that effort. And if I'm being honest, I'll tell you that my team was really looking forward to a little downtime after the election. That's not to say that we expected threats from cyber criminals or nation states to decrease, but the pressure of securing the election was intense, especially as we balanced doing so with bringing our workforce fully back into the office and keeping them safe from COVID-19. But before we could even transition from the election to our post-election intelligence assessments and our winter holidays, a call from Kevin Mandia at FireEye brought a renewed intensity as we surged resources into a multi-agency unified coordination group to address the SolarWinds campaign. And the pace has not let up ever since, with the Microsoft Exchange server intrusions, exploitation of Pulse Secure vulnerabilities, and disruptive ransomware attacks against a variety of U.S. critical infrastructure targets, most prominently the Colonial Pipeline. Since at least 2014, malicious cyber activity, and how we perceive it has been compared to a frog in gradually boiling water. Year over year, the number of incidents, the scale of their impact, and the threat to our national and economic security and to our public safety grows. But it grows in such a way that it continuously feels like the new normal. That's not sustainable, and it's not acceptable. That's why, in October, I spoke with you about the FBI's new cyber strategy. Announced by Director Wray last September, our strategy emphasizes the need to change the calculation that our adversaries are making when they decide they face more benefit than risk in using cyber intrusions against U.S. networks to achieve their objectives. The strategy identifies that the FBI will help change this by taking all of our authorities, capabilities, and partnerships and using them in support of not only our own actions, but for whatever measures we and our partners can take together that will have the most impact. Today, I want to share with you some examples of how that strategy has looked in practice so far by highlighting examples of actions we've taken to disrupt malicious cyber activity with our partners in recent months. The response from some of our private industry partners in particular has been clear. We like this emphasis on action, and we want to work more closely with you to do more of it. That's the type of partnership that's going to be necessary to disrupt criminal infrastructure, seize their proceeds, and make our adversaries think twice before they invest time and money into compromising U.S. networks. So let me talk through some of those examples. First, I want to highlight that this year's annual threat assessment released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in April assessed Iran's expertise and willingness to conduct aggressive cyber operations make it a significant threat to the security of U.S. and allied networks and data, including an ability to conduct attacks on critical infrastructure. To help blunt this threat, the FBI led a series of actions over a week in September 2020 to impose risk and consequences against the full spectrum of Iranian cyber threat activity, from Iran-based hackers to individuals inspired by the Iranian regime, to their contractors, and to Iranian governmental organizations, the IRGC and the MOIS. These coordinated, sequenced operations, including publishing a joint cybersecurity advisory with CISA, warning the public about a vulnerability being exploited by an Iran-based cyber actor group to compromise multiple U.S. industries. It included indictments against 2 hackers located in Iran and the Palestinian Authority, separate indictments against 2 Iranian nationals, sometimes working for their own profit and sometimes working on behalf of the government of Iran, to steal terabytes of proprietary data from multiple sensitive U.S. industries. It included indictments against 3 cyber actors who worked to steal critical information related to U.S. aerospace and satellite technology. It included the Department of Treasury announcing sanctions against an MOIS front company. And it included multiple releases of technical indicators for network defenders. You also saw the robust actions taken by the administration with support from the intelligence community to hold Russia accountable for SolarWinds and various other activities in cyber that we consider counter-normative. We were able to call out Russia, specifically the SVR, for that activity. The White House public statement, executive order, and sanctions against Russian actors were accompanied by 38 countries who issued some form of supportive public messaging, making this response the largest yet for a U.S. public attribution of malicious cyber activity. All of that would not have been possible without a closely coordinated and whole-of-government response to this incident. From the FBI's standpoint, through a mixture of information voluntarily shared with us and compelled through legal process, the FBI and DOJ were able to quickly identify the scale of compromised non-governmental entities from a worst case of 16,800 to fewer than 100. This action enabled focused engagement by the FBI and CISA with victims and improved our understanding of what the SVR chose to target among the larger set of exposed entities. But our work doesn't stop with this public attribution. We will continue to comb through data and make connections that will enable the FBI and our partners to take additional actions, identifying who did it and how to a level of detail that enables us to hold them responsible and, ideally, deter future such activity by the actors is our goal. To yield impactful results, we have to be innovative in our approach to the evolving threats. For 113 years now, the FBI has found innovative ways to remain agile so we can stay ahead of the threats and our adversaries. So when hacking groups exploited zero-day vulnerabilities in Microsoft Exchange Server software to install web shells, our response exemplified innovation and the core components of our strategy in action: unique authorities, world-class capabilities, and enduring partnerships. In this case, we acted on information shared with us by a private industry partner that identified the vulnerable machines. We developed a tool to remove the malicious backdoor, and we used our legal authorities to obtain a search warrant to execute an operation that eliminated the actor's ability to maintain persistent access to victim networks. If we had left that access unmitigated, the cyber actors in control of those web shells could have used them to maintain and escalate unauthorized remote access to US networks. Our focus on joint sequenced operations for maximum impact is not only aimed at nation-state activity. In January, the FBI was part of a coordinated global operation on an unprecedented scale to disrupt cyber intrusion activities enabled by Emotet infrastructure. Emotet was a go-to service for cyber criminals, opening the door with unauthorized access to victim networks that was then sold to other criminal groups for further illicit activities. For example, Emotet was used as the initial vector via spam email that allowed the download of TrickBot and then Ryuk ransomware. Although historically, criminal actors have reconstituted infrastructure shortly after law enforcement disruption, this operation took lessons learned and was designed to effectively disable multiple layers of critical malware infrastructure, making it more difficult for the actors to recover quickly. Earlier this month, working with DOJ, our fellow intelligence community agencies, and other government partners, we also used our law enforcement authorities to seize criminal proceeds from a Bitcoin wallet that DarkSide ransomware group, who was responsible for the Colonial Pipeline incident, used to collect ransomware payment from victims. We know that cybercriminal enterprises are motivated by profit above all else, to the point that they are willing to take down hospitals, the transportation of fuel, and the availability of our emergency services. So cutting off access this way to their criminal proceeds is a direct way of reducing their incentive to conduct these attacks. And on May 28th, DOJ announced the seizure of 2 command and control and malware distribution domains used in recent spear phishing activity that mimicked email communications from USAID. This action was focused on disrupting the malicious actors' follow-on exploitation of victims, as well as identifying additional compromised victims. Through these examples, you can see, first, the range of authorities the FBI is uniquely able to bring together to disrupt the increasingly harmful cyber activity of both criminal enterprises and nation states. Second, the range of partners that we work with to do so, from the intelligence community and DoD to private industry and global law enforcement. And third, our willingness to disrupt malicious cyber activity through a variety of actions that include but go well beyond arrests and indictments. The highly impactful incidents of the past 6 to 9 months show the investments in time, money, and talent that our adversaries will make to harm us. In some of these cases, we are dealing with sophisticated cyber actors with the full backing of their country's leaders. So we must take a comprehensive approach to defending our critical infrastructure, our national and economic security, and our public safety. Those of us in the intelligence community need to improve what we see about adversary plans, intentions, and actions. But also the private sector holds valuable cyber threat intelligence that exists nowhere else. So each of us is fighting half blind if we don't bring our perspectives together. When we think of key private sector partners, this includes providers, those in the IT and cybersecurity industry whose products and services give them unique visibility into how adversaries are traversing US networks. It also includes the owners and operators of critical infrastructure who best understand their industries and networks. But also our engagement with victims is an underappreciated piece of the puzzle. Our most sophisticated adversaries make pervasive use of strong encryption. They may connect from their home operating base through multiple servers in third countries to a server in the US, and then to a victim. But they're usually working through an encrypted tunnel along that whole chain. But on the victim network, they show their hand. There's no substitute for visibility into what the adversary is doing on victim networks, or for the information victims have about where that adversary went next. Very often, for example, cyber actors use different infrastructure to exfiltrate or steal data than they use to gain the initial access. We need to be able to find that next destination, that next hop, to figure out what else the adversary is doing from those servers and to position ourselves or enable our partners to disrupt that activity. This is just part of why the FBI devotes so much effort across the country to working with victims and with companies before they're victimized, who we assess adversaries are likely to target. Each of these incidents and engagements can provide us additional clues we need to pursue those responsible. So we work with the victim to collect technical evidence we can run against our databases and that we can share with our government partners so they can do the same. Much like a serial killer, cyber actors will continue to target additional victims with the same MO until they're forced to change. So every detail we gather moves us a step closer to finding them and stopping them before they strike again. Even when, as a victim, your focus is on recovery and remediation, the FBI can work alongside your team unobtrusively to collect this valuable information, share the tactics we learned with the intelligence community, cybersecurity and law enforcement agencies, and network defenders, and then feed our knowledge into the development of new joint sequenced operations to go back at the adversary. This focus over time will help turn the tide against those who think they can compromise our networks, steal our intellectual property, and hold our critical infrastructure at risk, all without incurring risk themselves. That's not sustainable, and it's not acceptable. If you agree, please help us by building a relationship with your local FBI field office before an incident occurs and contacting and working closely with us when one does. Thank you.